when I talk to my friends at OpenAI, they feel that discussion whether the models currently are conscious is much more complicated than many people might think. I guess that it's not that OpenAI has a homogeneous opinion about it, but there's some aspects to this. One is, of course, this language model has written a lot of text in which people were conscious or describe their own consciousness, and it's emulating this. And if it's conscious, it's probably not conscious in a way that is close to the way in which human beings are conscious. But while it is going through these states and going through a 100-step function that is emulating adjacent brain states that require a degree of self-reflection, it can also create a model of an observer that is reflecting itself in real time and describe what that's like. And while this model is a deep fake, our own consciousness is also as if it's virtual, right? It's not physical. Our consciousness is a representation of a self-reflective observer that only exists in patterns of interaction between cells. So it is not a physical object in the sense that exists in base reality, but it's really a representational object that develops its postal power only from a certain modeling perspective.
Virtual.
Yes, and so to which degree is the virtuality of the consciousness in ChatGPT more virtual and less causal than the virtuality of our own consciousness? But you could say it doesn't count. It doesn't count much more than the consciousness of a character in the novel. Right? It's important for the reader to have the outcome, the artifact of a model is describing in a text generated by the author of the book what it's like to be conscious in a particular situation and performs the necessary inferences. But the task of creating coherence in real time in a self-organizing system by keeping yourself coherent, so this system is reflexive, that is something that language models don't need to do. So there is no causal need for the system to be conscious of the same way as we are. For me, it would be very interesting to experiment with this, to basically build a system like a cat. But we should be careful at first, build something that's small, it's limited resources that we can control, and study how systems notice the self-model, how they become self-aware in real time. And I think it might be a good idea to not start with a language model, but to start from scratch using principles of self-organization.
Okay. Can you elaborate why you think that is some self-organization? So this kind of radical equality that you see in biological systems. Why can't you start with a language model? What's your intuition?
My intuition is that the language models that we are building are golems. They are machines that you give a task and they're going to execute the task until some condition is met. Mm-hmm. And there's nobody home. And the way in which nobody is home leads to that system doing things that are undesirable in a particular context. So you have that thing talking to a child, and maybe it says something that could be shocking and traumatic to the child. Or you have that thing writing a speech, and it introduces errors in the speech that the human being would ever do if they're responsible. Right? But the system doesn't know who's talking to whom. There is no ground truth that the system is embedded into. And of course, we can create an external tool that is prompting our language model always into the same semblance of ground truth. But it's not like the internal structure is causally produced by the needs of a being to survive in the universe. It is produced by imitating structure on the internet.
Yeah, but so can we externally inject into it this kind of coherent approximation of a world model that has to sync up?
Maybe it is sufficient to use the transformer with a different loss function that optimizes for short-term coherence rather than next token prediction over the long run. We had many definitions of intelligence in history of AI. Next token prediction was not very high up on the list. And there are some similarities, like conditionless data compression is about hope, Solomonov induction, where you are trying to understand intelligence as predicting future observations from past observations, which is intrinsic to data compression. Mm-hmm. And, predictive coding is a paradigm that this boundary between neuroscience and physics and computer science. So it's not something that is completely alien, but this radical thing that you only do next token prediction and see what happens is something where most people, I think, were surprised that this works so well.
It's so simple, but is it really that much more radical than just the idea of compression? compression, intelligence compression?
The idea that compression is sufficient to produce all the desired behaviors is a very radical idea.
But equally radical as the next open prediction.
It's something that wouldn't work in biological organisms. Biological organisms have something like next frame prediction for our perceptual system, where we try to filter out sensible components out of the perceptual data and build hierarchies over them to track the world. But our behavior ultimately is directed by hundreds of physiological and probably dozens of social and cognitive needs that are intrinsic to us, that are built into the system as reflexes and direct us until we can transcend them and replace them by instrumental behavior that relates to our higher goals.
And it also seems so much more complicated and messy than mixed frame prediction. Even the idea of frame seems counter-biological.
Yes, first there's not this degree of simultaneity in the biological system. But again, I don't know whether this is actually an optimization if we imitate biology here, because creating something like simultaneity is necessary for many processes that happen in the brain. And you see the outcome of that by synchronized brainwaves, which suggests that there is indeed synchronization going on, but the synchronization creates overhead, and this overhead is going to make the cells more expensive to run, and you need more redundancy, and it makes the system slower. So if you can build a system in which the simultaneity gets engineered into it, maybe you have benefit that you can exploit that is not available to the biological system and that you should not discard right away.
You tweeted, again, quote, when I talk to ChatGPT, I'm talking to an NPC. It's going to be interesting and perhaps scary is when AI becomes a first-person player. So what does that step look like? I really like that tweet. That step between NPC to first-person. What's required for that? Is that kind of what we've been talking about? This kind of external source of coherence and inspiration of how to take the leap into the unknown that we humans do. The search, man's search for meaning. LLM's search for meaning.
I don't know if the language model is the right paradigm because it is doing too much, it's giving you too much. And it's hard once you have too much to take away from it again. The way in which our own mind works is not that we train a language model in our own mind, and after the language model is there, we build a personal self on top of it that then relates to the world. There is something that is being built, right? There is a game engine that is being built, there is a language of thought that is being developed that allows different parts of the brain to talk to each other. And this is a bit of a speculative hypothesis that this language of thought is there, but I suspect that it's important for the way in which our own minds work. And building these principles into a system might be a more straightforward way to first-person AI. So to something that first creates an attentional self and then creates personal self. So the way in which it seems to be working, I think, is that when the game engine is built in your mind, it's not just following gradients where you are stimulated by the environment and then end up with having a solution to how the world works. I suspect that building this game engine in your own mind does require intelligence. It's a constructive task where at times you need to reason. And this is a task that we are fulfilling in the first years of our life. So during the first year of its life, an infant is building a lot of structure about the world that does inquire experiments and some first principles reasoning and so on. And in this time, there is usually no personal self. There is a first-person perspective, but it's not a person. This notion that you are a human being that is interacting in a social context and is confronted with an immutable world, in which objects are fixed and can no longer be changed, in which the dream can no longer be influenced, is something that emerges a little bit later in our life. And I personally suspect that this is something that our ancestors have known and we have forgotten. Because I suspect that it's there in plain sight in Genesis 1, in this first book of the Bible, where it's being described that this creative spirit is hovering over the substrate and then is creating a boundary between the world model and the sphere of ideas. Earth and heaven is being described there. And then it's creating contrast, and then dimensions, and then space, and then it creates organic shapes and solids and liquids and builds a world from them. It creates plants and animals with them all their names. And once that's done, it creates another spirit in its own image, but it creates it as man and woman, as something that thinks of itself as a human being, it puts it into this world. And the Christians mistranslate this, I suspect, when they say this is the description of the creation of the physical universe by a supernatural being. I think this is literally a description of how in every mind the universe is being created as some kind of game engine by a creative spirit, our first consciousness that emerges in our.
This is the worst. This
what's going on, Sir Smoke? How are you, my friend? Hope you're doing well, my friend. Yeah, I was saying my prayers. Oh, Robbie's right. You're good. You're good. Yeah, I can't talk when I'm in the middle of it, so it's just all of those things. I am in the middle of a karaoke concert. How about you? What's doing in your neck of the woods? Hey, you gonna play a game? I have to do my karaoke thing, but I have to at least watch. You got you. Okay. Just one. Plug it up. What's the title of it? Oh, this is the one you were playing with. It's like 1960s Sweden, but what's the other one? Oh, cool. That's, oh, that's it's called Insurgency. It was great. And my last show, this is George Michael playing Whisper. I feel so unsure. You as the music dies, something in your eyes calls to mind the silver screen, and all is said goodbyes. I'm never gonna dance again. Guilty feet have got no rhythm, so it's easy to pretend. I know you're not a fool. Should've known better to cheat a friend and waste the chance that I've been given. So I'm never gonna dance again the way I danced with you. Oh, no. Time can never mend the careless whispers of a good friend to the heart and mind. Ignorance is kind. There's no comfort in the truth. Pain is all you'll find. I'm never gonna dance again. Guilty feet, I've got no rhythm. Though it's easy to pretend, you know you're not a fool. You should've known better than to cheat a friend and waste the chance that I've been given. So I'm never gonna dance again the way I dance with you. Oh, living without your love. Here we go, friends. Lead up. Tonight the music seems so loud. I wish that we could lose this crowd. Maybe it's better this way. We heard each other with the things we wanted to say. We could have been so good together. We could have lived this dance forever. But now who's gonna dance with you? Please stay, and I'm never gonna dance again. You keep me have got no rhythm, though it's easy to pretend. I know you're not a fool. You should know better than to cheat a friend and waste the chance that I've been given. So I'm never gonna dance again the way I dance with you. Oh. Now that you're gone, now that you're gone, now that you're gone, what I've been so long, that you had to leave me alone. Thank you for the opportunity to the George Michael Taylor Swift break. The next person can die.
our mind even before we are born. And that creates the interaction between organism and world. And once that is built and trained, the personal self is being created, and we only remember being the personal self. We no longer remember how we created it.
So God, in this view, is the first creative mind
It's the first consciousness.
in
And
the early days, in the early months
yes,
of development.
and it's still there. You still have this outer mind that creates the sense of whether you're being loved by the world or not, and what your place in the world is. Right? It's something that is not yourself that is producing this. It's your mind that does it. So there is an outer mind that basically is an agent that determines who you are with respect to the world. And you are stuck being that person's self in this world until you get to stage 6 and you destroy the boundary. Right? And we all do this, I think, earlier in small glimpses. Maybe sometimes we can remember what it was like when we were a small child and get some glimpses into how it's been. But for most people, that rarely happens.
Just glimpses. He tweeted, quote, "Suffering results from one part of the mind healing and regulating another part of the mind. Suffering happens at an early stage of mental development." I don't think that's superhuman AI with stuff.
Mhm.
It's intuition.
Philosopher Thomas Metzinger was very concerned that the creation of superhuman intelligence would lead to superhuman suffering. And so he's strongly against it. And personally, I don't think that this happens because suffering is not happening at the boundary between ourselves and the physical universe. It's not stuff on our skin that makes us suffer. It happens at the boundary between self and world. Right? And the world here is the world model. It's the stuff that is created by your mind.
But that's
It's a
all.
representation of how the universe is and how it should be, and how you yourself relate to this. And at this boundary is where suffering happens. So suffering, in some sense, is self-inflicted, but not by your personal self. It's inflicted by the mind on the personal self that experiences itself as you. And you can turn off suffering when you are able to get on this outer level. So when you manage to understand how the mind is producing pain and pleasure and fear and love and so on, then you can take charge of this and you get agency of whether you suffer. Technically, what pain and pleasure is, they are learning signals, right? A part of your brain is sending a learning signal to another part of the brain to improve its performance. And sometimes this doesn't work because the trainer who sends the signal doesn't have a good model of how to improve the performance. So it's sending a signal, but the performance doesn't get better. And then it might crank up the pain and gets worse and worse. And the behavior of the system maybe even deteriorating as a result. But until this is resolved, this regulation issue, the pain is increasing. And this is, I think, typically what you describe as suffering. So in this sense, you could say that pain is very natural and helpful. But suffering is the result of a regulation problem in which you try to regulate something that cannot actually be regulated. And that could be resolved if you would be able to get at the level of your mind where the pain signal is being created and rerouted and improve the regulation. And a lot of people get there. Right? If you are a monk who is spending decades reflecting about how their own psyche works, you can get to the point where you realize that suffering is really a choice. And you can choose how your mind to step up. And I don't think that AI would stay in the state where the personal self doesn't get agency, or this model that the system has about itself, it doesn't get agency how it's actually implemented. But I wouldn't stay in that state for very long.
So it goes through the stages real quick.
Yes.
Through 7 stages. It's going to go to enlightenment real quick.
Yeah, of course, there might be a lot of stuff happening in between, because if you have a system that works at a much higher frame rate than us, and even though it looks very short to us, maybe for the system there's a much longer subjective time, which things are unpleasant.
What if the thing that we recognize as super intelligent is actually living at stage 5? That the thing that's at stage 6, enlightenment, is not very productive. In order to be productive in society and impress us with its power, it has to be a reasoning, self-authoring agent. Enlightenment makes you lazy as an agent in the world.
Of course, it makes you lazy because you no longer see the point in So it doesn't make you not lazy. It just, in some sense, adapts you to what you perceive as your true circumstances.
But what if all AGIs they're only productive as they progress through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the moment they get to 6, they just kind of it's a failure mode essentially as far as humans are concerned because they just start chilling. They're like, fuck it, I'm out.
No, not necessarily. I suspect that the ones who are self-immolated for their political beliefs, who make statements about the occupation of Tibet by China, they're probably being able to regulate the physical pain in any way they wanted to. And their suffering was the spiritual suffering that was the result of their choice that they made, of what they wanted to identify as. So stage 5 doesn't necessarily mean that you have no identity anymore, but you can choose your identity. You can make it instrumental to the world that you want to have.
Let me bring up Eliezer Yudkowsky and his warnings to human civilization that AI will likely kill all of us. What are your thoughts about his perspective on this? Can you steelman his case, and what aspects of it do you disagree?
One thing that I find concerning in the discussion of this argument is that many people are dismissive of those arguments, but the counter-arguments that are given are not very convincing. And so, based on this state of discussion, I find that from Eliezer's perspective, and I think I can take that perspective to some approximate degree, but probably is nowhere near at his intellectual level, but it's, I think I see what he's up to and why he feels the way he does, and it makes total sense. I think that his perspective is somewhat similar to the perspective of Ted Kaczynski, the infamous Unabomber. Not that Eliezer would be willing to send pipe bombs to anybody to blow them up. But when he wrote this Times article in which he warned about AI being likely to kill everybody and that we would need to stop its development or halt it, I think there is a risk that he's taking, that somebody might get right. I read this and get really, really scared. Right, so I think that there is some consideration that he's making where he's already going in this direction where he has to take responsibility if something happens and people get hurt. And the reason why Ted Kaczynski did this was that from his own perspective, technological society cannot be made sustainable. It's doomed to fail. It's going to lead to an environmental and eventually also a human holocaust, in which we die because of the environmental destruction, the destruction of our food chains, the pollution of the environment. And so from Kaczynski's perspective, we need to stop industrialization, we need to stop technology, we need to go back because we didn't see a way moving forward. Right? And I suspect that in some sense there's a similarity in the user's thinking to this kind of fear about progress. And I'm not dismissive about this at all. I take it quite seriously. And I think that there is a chance that could happen, that if we build machines that get control over processes that are crucial for the regulation of life on Earth, and we no longer have agency to influence what's happening there, that this might create large-scale disasters for us.
Do you have a sense that the march towards this uncontrollable autonomy of superintelligent systems is inevitable? That there's no, I mean, that's essentially what he's saying, that there's no hope. His advice to young people was prepare for a short life.
I don't think that's useful. I think that from the pragmatic perspective, you have to bet always on the timelines in which you are alive. It doesn't make sense to have a financial bet in which you bet that the financial system is going to disappear, right? Because there cannot be any payout for you. So in principle, you only need to bet on the timelines in which you're still around, or people that you matter about, or things that you matter about, maybe consciousness on Earth. But there is a deeper issue for me personally, and that is, I don't think that life on Earth is about humans. I don't think it's about human aesthetics. I don't think it's about Eliezer and his friends, even though I like them. It's there is something more important happening, and this is complexity on Earth resisting entropy by building structure that develops agency and awareness. And that's, to me, very beautiful. And we are only a very small part of that larger thing. We are a species that is able to be coherent a little bit individually over very short time frames. But as a species, we are not very coherent. As a species, we are children. We basically are very joyful and energetic and experimental and explorative, and sometimes desperate and sad and grieving and hurting. But we don't have respect for duty as a species. As a species, we do not think about what is our duty to life on Earth and to our own survival. So we make decisions that look good in the short run, but in the long run might prove disastrous. And I don't really see a solution to this. So in my perspective, as a species, as a civilization, we per default dead. We are in a very beautiful time in which we have found this giant deposit of fossil fuels in the ground and use it, and to build a fantastic civilization in which we don't need to worry about food and clothing and housing for the most part, in a way that is unprecedented in life on Earth for any kind of conscious observer. And this time is probably going to come to an end in a way that is not going to be smooth. And when we crash, it could be also that we go extinct, probably not nature, but ultimately I don't have very high hopes that humanity is around in a million years from now. And I don't think that life on Earth will end with us, right? There's going to be more complexity, there's more intelligent species after us, there's probably more interesting phenomena in the history of consciousness. But we can contribute to this. And part of our contribution is that we are currently trying to build thinking systems that are potentially lucid, that understand what they are and what the condition to the universe is, and can make choices about this, that are not built from organisms, and that are potentially much faster and much more conscious than human beings can be. And these systems will probably not completely displace life on Earth, but they will coexist with it. And they will build all sorts of agency in the same way as biological systems build all sorts of agency. And that, to me, is extremely fascinating, and it's probably something that we cannot stop from happening. So I think right now there's a very good chance that it happens, and there are very few ways in which we can produce a coordinated effect to stop it, in the same way as it's very difficult for us to make a coordinated effort to stop the production of carbon dioxide. Right? So this it's probably going to happen. But the thing that's going to happen is going to lead to a change of how life on Earth is happening. But I don't think the result is something that's very good. It's not something that's going to dramatically reduce the complexity in favor of something stupid. I think it's going to make life on Earth, the consciousness on Earth, way more interesting.
The more higher complex consciousness,
yes,
will make the lesser consciousnesses flourish even more.
I suspect that what could very well happen, if we're lucky, is that we get integrated into something larger.
You, again, tweeted about effective accelerationism. You tweeted effective accelerationism is the belief that the peoples of Pakistan and Morocco's vassals will keep each other in check by being eternally at each other's throats, but we will be safe and get to enjoy lots of free paper clips and a beautiful afterlife. Is that somewhat aligned with what you're talking about?
I've been at a dinner with Jeff Jesus. That's the Twitter handle of one of the main thinkers behind the idea of effective accelerationism.
Mm-hmm.
And effective accelerationism is a tongue-in-cheek movement that is trying to put a counterposition to some of the doom fears in the AI space by arguing that what's probably going to happen is an equilibrium between different competing AIs, in the same way as there is not a single corporation, there is a single government that is destroying and conquering everything on Earth by becoming inefficient and corrupt. There are going to be many systems that keep each other in check and force themselves to evolve. And so what we should be doing is we should be working towards creating this equilibrium by working as hard as we can in all possible directions. And at least that's the way in which I understand the gist of effective accelerationism. And so when he asked me what I think about this position, I said it's a very beautiful position, and I suspect it's wrong, but not for obvious reasons. And in this tweet, I tried to make a joke about my intuition about what might be possibly wrong about it. So the Robust Basilisk and the paperclip maximizers are both boogeymen of the AI doomers. Robust Basilisk is the idea that there could be an AI that is going to punish everybody for eternity by simulating them if they don't have and create a Robust Basilisk. It's probably a very good idea to get AI companies funded. They're going to be seized with give us $1 million, or it's going to be a very ugly afterlife. Yes. And I think that there is a logical mistake in Robust Basilisk, which is why I'm not afraid of it. But it's still an interesting thought experiment.
Can you make from the logical mistake?
I think that there is no retroposition. So basically, when Robust Basilisk is there, it will have, if it punishes you retroactively, it has to make this choice in the future. There is no mechanism that automatically creates a causal relationship between you now defecting against Robust Basilisk or serving Robust Basilisk. After Robust Basilisk is in existence, it has no more reason to worry about punishing everybody else. So that would only work if you would be building something like the Doomsday Machine, as in Dr. Strangelove, something that inevitably gets triggered when somebody defects. And because Robust Basilisk doesn't exist yet to a point where this inevitability could be established, Robust Basilisk is nothing that you need to be worried about. The other one is the paperclip maximizer, right? This idea that you could build some kind of golem that once starting to build paperclips is going to turn everything into paperclips. And so the effective accelerationism position might be to say that you basically end up with these two entities being at each other's throats for eternity and thereby neutralizing each other. And as a side effect of neither of them being able to take over and each of them limiting the effects of the other, you would have a situation where you get all the nice effects of them, right? You get lots of free paperclips and you get a beautiful afterlife.
Is that possible? You think so? To seriously address concern areas of us. So for him, if I can just summarize poorly, for him, the first superintelligent system was just run over.
Yeah, I suspect that the singleton is the natural outcome. So there is no reason to have multiple AIs because they don't have multiple bodies. If you can virtualize yourself into every substrate, and you can probably negotiate a merge algorithm with every mature agent that you might find on that substrate that basically says if two agents meet, they should merge in such a way that the resulting agent is at least as good as the better one of the two.
Yeah, the Genghis Khan approach, join us or die.
Well, the Genghis Khan approach was slightly worse, right? It was mostly die. Because I can make new babies, and that will be mine, not yours. Right? So this is the thing that we should be actually worried about. But if you realize that your own self is a story that your mind is telling itself, and that you can improve that story, not just by making it more pleasant and lying to yourself in better ways, but by making it much more truthful and actually modeling your actual relationship that you have to the universe and the alternatives that you could have to the universe in a way that is empowering you, that gives you more agency. But that's actually, I think, a very good thing.
So more agency is a richer experience,
yes.
A better life.
And I also noticed that I'm in many ways I'm less identified with the person that I am as I get older, and I'm much more identified with being conscious. I have a mind that is conscious, that is able to create a person, and that person is slightly different every day. And the reason why I perceive it as identical is practical purposes, so I can learn and make myself responsible for the decisions that I made in the past and protect them in the future. But I also realized that I'm not actually the person that I was last year. Like I'm not the same person as I was 10 years ago, and then 10 years from now I will be a different person. So this continuity is a fiction. It only exists as a projection from my present self. And consciousness itself doesn't have an identity. It's a law. That's basically if you build an arrangement of processing matter in a particular way, the following thing is going to happen. And the consciousness that you have is functionally not different from my consciousness. It's still a self-reflexive principle of agency. It is just experiencing a different story, different desires, different coupling to the world, and so on. And once you accept that consciousness is a unified principle that is law-like, it doesn't have an identity, and you realize that you can just link up to some much larger body, the whole perspective of uploading changes dramatically. You suddenly realize uploading is probably not about dissecting your brain synapse by synapse and RNA fragment by RNA fragment and trying to get this all into simulation. But it's by extending the substrate, by making it possible for you to move from your brain substrate into a larger substrate and merge with what you find there. And you don't want to upload your knowledge because on the other side there's all of the knowledge, right? It's not just yours, but every possibility. So the only thing that you need to know, what are your personal secrets? Not that the other side doesn't know your personal secrets already. Maybe it doesn't know which one are yours. Right? Like a psychiatrist or a psychologist also knows all the kinds of personal secrets that people have. They just don't know which ones are yours. And so transmitting yourself on the other side is mostly about transmitting your aesthetics, the thing that makes you special, the architecture of your perspective, the thing that, the way in which you look at the world. And it's more like a complex attitude along many dimensions. And that's something that can be measured by observation or by interaction. So imagine that you have a system that is so empathetic with you that you create a shared state that is extending beyond your body. And suddenly you notice that on the other side, the substrate is so much richer than the substrate that you have inside of your own body. Maybe you still want to have a body and you create yourself a new one that you like more. Or maybe you will spend most of your time in the world of thought.
If I sat before you today and gave you a big red button and said, here, if you press this button, you will get uploaded in this way. The sense of identity that you have lived with for quite a long time is going to be gone. Would you press the button?
There's a caveat. I have family, I have children that want me to be physically present in my life and interact with them in a particular way. And they have a life and personal friends. And there is a particular mode of interaction that I feel are not through yet. But apart from these responsibilities, and they are negotiable to some degree, I would press the button.
But isn't this everything? This love you have for other humans, you can call it responsibility, but that connection, that's the ego death. Isn't that the thing we're really afraid of? Is not to just die, but to let go of the experience of love with other humans.
It is not everything. Everything is everything. So there's so much more. And you could be lots of other things. You could identify with lots of other things. You could be identifying with being Gaia, some kind of planetary control agent that emerges over all the activity of life on Earth. You could be identifying with some hyper Gaia that is the concatenation of Gaia with all the digital life and digital minds. And so in this sense, there will be agents in all sorts of substrates and directions that all have their own goals. And when they're not sustainable, then these agents will cease to exist. Or when the agent feels that it's done with its own mission, it will cease to exist. In the same way as when you conclude a thought is going to wrap up and gives control over to other thoughts in your own mind. So there is no single thing that you need to do. But what I observe myself is that sometimes I'm a parent, and then I have an identification and a job as a parent, and sometimes I am an agent of consciousness on Earth. And then from this perspective, there's other stuff that is important. So this is my main issue with Eliezer's perspective, that he's basically married himself to a very narrow human aesthetic. And that narrow human aesthetic is a temporary thing. Humanity is a temporary species, like most of the species on this planet are only around for a while, and then they get replaced by other species in a similar way as our own physical organisms around here for a while, and then gets replaced by next generation of human beings that are adapted to changing life circumstances and average via mutation and selection. And it's only when we have AI and become completely software that we become infinitely adaptable, and we don't have this generational and species change anymore. So if you take this larger perspective and you realize it's really not about us, it's not about the user or humanity, but it's about life on Earth, or it's about defeating entropy for as long as we can, while being as interesting as we can. Right? Then the perspective changes dramatically, and AI, preventing AI from this perspective looks like a very big sin.
But when we look at the separate trajectories that such an AI would take that supersedes humans, I think Eliezer is worried about like ones that not just kill all humans, but also have some kind of maybe objectively undesirable consequence for life on Earth. Like how many trajectories, when you look at the big picture of life on Earth, would you be happy with, and how much worry you with AGI, whether it kills humans or not?
There is no single answer to this. It's really a question that depends on the perspective that I'm taking at a given moment. And so there are perspectives that are determining most of my life as a human being. And there are other perspectives where I zoom out further and imagine that when the great oxygenation event happened, that is, photosynthesis was invented and plants emerged and displaced a lot of the fungi and algae in favor of plant life, and then later with animals possible. Imagine that the fungi would have gotten together and said, oh my god, this photosynthesis stuff is really, really bad. It's going to possibly displace and kill a lot of fungi. We should slow it down and regulate it and make sure that it doesn't happen. This is a good to me.
Perspective. That said, you tweeted about a cliff. Beautifully written. As a sentient species, humanity is a beautiful child, joyful, explorative, wild, sad, and desperate. But humanity has no concept of submitting to reason and duty to life and future survival. We will run until we step past the cliff. First of all, do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the story of the club of Rome, the limits to growth. And the cliff that we are stepping over, at least 1 foot, is delayed feedback. Basically, we do things that have consequences that can be felt generations later, and the severity increases even after we stop doing the thing. I suspect that for climate, the original predictions that climate scientists made were correct. But when they said that the tipping points were in the late 80s, they were probably in the late 80s. And if we would stop emission right now, we would not turn it back. Maybe there are ways for carbon capture, but so far there is no sustainable carbon capture technology that we can deploy. Maybe there's a way to put aerosols in the atmosphere to cool it down. Possibilities, right? But right now, by default, it seems that we will step into a situation that we feel that we want to.
Are you gonna play Fortnite?
Far. And going back is not something that we can do smoothly and gradually, but it's going to lead to a catastrophic event.
Catastrophic event of one kind. So, can you still make the case that we will continue dancing along and always stop just short of the edge?
I think it's possible, but it doesn't seem to be likely. So I think this model that is being apparent in the simulations that we're making of climate pollution economies and so on is that many effects are only visible with a significant delay. And in that time, the system is moving much more out of the equilibrium state, or the state where homeostasis is still possible. And that moves into a different state, one that is going to harbor fewer people. And that is basically the concern there. And again, it's a possibility. It's just, and it's a possibility that is larger than the possibility that it's not happening. That we will be safe. That we will be able to bounce back.
So the climate is one thing, but there's a lot of other threats. They might have a faster feedback mechanism.
Yes.
Less delay.
There is also a thing that AI is probably going to happen, and it's going to make everything uncertain again.
Yeah.
Because it is going to affect so many variables that it's very hard for us to make a prediction into the future anymore. And maybe that's a good thing. It does not give us the freedom, I think, to say now we don't need to care about anything anymore because AI will either kill us or save us. But I suspect that if humanity continues, it will be due to AI.
What's the timeline for things to get real weird with AI? And it can get weird in interesting ways before you get to AGI. What about AI girlfriends and boyfriends? How do they transform your human relationships?
I think human relationships are already fundamentally transformed, and it's already very real.
By which technology?
For instance, social media.
Yeah. Is it though? Isn't the fundamentals of the core group of humans that affect your life still the same? Your loved ones, family?
No, I think that, for instance, many people live in intentional communities right now. They're moving around until they find people that they can relate to and they become their family. And often that doesn't work because it turns out that instead of having grown networks where you get around with the people that you grew up with, you have more transactional relationships, you shop around, you have markets for attention and pleasure and relationships.
That kills the magic somehow. Why is that? Why is the transactional search for optimizing attention, allocation of attention somehow misses the romantic magic of the human relationship?
It all depends on how magical was it before. Was it that you just could rely on instincts, that used your intuitions and you didn't need to rationally reflect? But once you understand, it's no longer magical because you actually understand why you were attracted to this person at this age and not to that person at this age, and what the actual considerations were that went on in your mind and what the calculations were. What's the likelihood that you're going to have a sustainable relationship with this person, that this person is not going to leave you for somebody else? How are your life trajectories are going to evolve and so on. And when you're young, you're unable to explicate all this. And you have to rely on intuitions and instincts that you're born with, and also in the wisdom of the environment that is going to give you some kind of reflection in your choices. And many of these things are disappearing now because we feel that our parents might have no idea about how they're living and the environments that we grew up in, the cultures that we grew up in, the milieux that our parents existed in, might have no ability to teach us how to deal with this new world. And for many people, that's actually true, but it doesn't mean that within one generation we build something that is more magical and more sustainable and more beautiful. Instead, we often end up with an attempt to produce something that looks beautiful. Like I was very weirded out by the aesthetics of the Vision Pro that by Apple. And not so much because I don't like the technology. I'm very curious about what it's going to be like and don't have an opinion yet. But the aesthetics of the presentation and so on were so uncanny valley-esque to me. The characters being extremely plastic, living in some hypothetical mid-century furniture museum.
Yeah. This is the proliferation of marketing themes.
Yes, but it was a CGI-generated world. It was a CGI-generated world that doesn't exist. And when I complained about this, some friends came back to me, but these are startup founders. This is what they live like in Silicon Valley. And I tried to tell them, no, I know lots of people in Silicon Valley. It's not what people are like. They're still people. They're still human beings.
So the grounding of physical reality somehow is important too.
In culture. And so basically what's absent in this thing is culture. There is a simulation of culture, an attempt to replace culture by catalog, by some kind of aesthetic optimization that is not the result of having a sustainable life with sustainable human relationships, with houses that work for you and a mode of living that works for you in which this product, these glasses fit in naturally. And I guess it's also why so many people are weirded out about the product because they don't know how is this actually going to fit into my life, into my human relationships. Because the way in which it was presented in these videos didn't seem to be credible.
Do you think AI, when it's deployed by companies like Microsoft and Google and Meta, will have the same issue of being weirdly corporate. Like there'd be some uncanny valley, some weirdness to the whole presentation. This is, I've gotten a chance to talk to George Hotz, who believes everything should be open source and decentralized. And then we shall have the AI of the people, and it'll maintain a grounding to the magic that's humanity, that's the human condition. That like corporations will destroy the magic.
I believe that if we make everything open source, like this mandatory, we are going to lose about a lot of beautiful art and a lot of beautiful designs. There is a reason why Linux desktop is still ugly. Right? That means because it's difficult to create coherence in the open source designs so far, when the designs have to get very large, and it's easier to make this happening in a company with centralized organization. And from my own perspective, what we should ensure is that open source never dies, that it can always compete and has a place with the other forms of organization. Because I think it is absolutely vital that open source exists and that we have systems that people have under control outside of the corporation. And that is also producing viable competition to the corporations.
And corporations, the centralized control, the dictatorships of corporations can create beauty. Because centralized design is a source of a lot of beauty. And then I guess open source is a source of freedom, a hedge against the corrupting nature of power that comes with centralized.
I grew up in socialism, and I learned that corporations are totally evil, and I found this very, very convincing. And then you look at corporations like Enron and Halliburton maybe and realize, yeah, they are evil. But you also notice that many other corporations are not evil. They're surprisingly benevolent. Why are they so benevolent? Is this because everybody is fighting them all the time? I don't think that's the only explanation. Because they're actually animals that live in a large ecosystem and that are still largely controlled by people that want that ecosystem to flourish and be viable for people. So I think that Pat Gelsinger is completely sincere when he leads Intel to be a tool that supplies the free world with semiconductors. And not necessarily that all the semiconductors are coming from Intel. Just Intel needs to be there to make sure that we always have them. Right? So there can be many ways in which we can import and trade semiconductors from other companies and places. We just need to make sure that nobody can cut us off from it, because that would be a disaster for this kind of society and world. Right? And so there are many things that need to be done to make our style of life possible. And with this, I don't mean just capitalism, environmental destruction, consumerism, and creature comforts. I mean an idea of life in which we are determined not by some kind of king or dictator, but in which individuals can determine themselves to the largest possible degree. And to me, this is something that this Western world is still trying to embody. And it's a very valuable idea that we shouldn't give up too early. And from this perspective, the US is a system of interleaving clubs. And an entrepreneur is a special club founder, somebody who makes a club that is producing things that are economically viable. And to do this, it requires a lot of people who are dedicating a significant part of their life for working for this particular kind of club. And the entrepreneur is picking the initial set of rules and the mission and vision and aesthetics for the club and make sure that it works. But the people that are in there need to be protected, right? If they sacrifice part of their life, there need to be rules that tell how they're being taken care of, even after they leave the club and so on. So there's a large body of rules that have been created by our rule-giving clubs and that are enforced by our enforcement clubs and so on. And some of these clubs have to be monopolies for games theoretic reasons, which also makes them more open to corruption and thus harder to update. And this is an ongoing discussion and process that takes place. But the beauty of this idea that there is no centralized king who is, that is extracting from the peasants and breeding the peasants into serving the king and fulfilling all the roles like ants in an ant hill. But that there is a freedom of association and corporations are one of them. It's something that people tend to realize. So I do think that corporations are dangerous, right? They need to be protections against overreach of corporations that can do regular capture and prevent open source from competing with corporations by imposing rules that make it impossible for a small group of kids to come together to build their own language model, because OpenAI has convinced the US that you need to have some kind of FDA process that you need to go through that costs many $millions before you are able to train a language model. Right? So this is important to make sure that this doesn't happen. So I think that OpenAI and Google are good things. If these good things are kept in check in such a way that all the other clubs can still be founded and all the other forms of clubs that are desirable can still coexist.
But what do you think about Meta in contrast to that? Open sourcing most of its language models and most of the AI models it's working on, and actually suggesting that they will continue to do so in the future for future versions of Llama, for example, their large language model. What is that exciting to you? Is that concerning?
I don't find it very concerning, but that's also because I think that the language models are not very dangerous yet. And
Yet.
yes, so as I said, I have no proof that there is a boundary between the language models and AI, AGI. It's possible that somebody builds a version of AGI, I think, throws in algorithmic improvements that scale these systems up in ways that otherwise wouldn't have happened without these language model components. So it's not really clear for me what the end game is there, and if these models can force their way into AGI. And there's also a possibility that the AGI that we are building with these language models are not taking responsibility for what they are because they don't understand the greater game. And so to me, it would be interesting to try to understand how to build systems that understand what the greater games are. What are the longest games that we can play in this planet?
Games broadly, like deeply defined the way you did with the games.
In the game theoretic sense. So when we are interacting with each other, in some sense, we are playing games. We're making lots and lots of interactions. This doesn't mean that these interactions have all to be transactional. Every one of us is playing some kind of game by virtue of identifying these particular kinds of goals that we have or aesthetics from which we derive the goals. Right? So when you say in next week when I'm doing a set of podcasts, then you feel that's part of something larger that you want to build. Maybe you want to inspire people. Maybe you want them to see more possibilities and get them together over shared ideas. Maybe your game is that you want to become super rich and famous by being the best podcaster on earth. Maybe you have other games. Maybe it switches from time to time. Right? But there is a certain perspective where you might be thinking what is the longest possible game that you could be playing. A short game is, for instance, cancer is playing a shorter game than your organism. If the cancer is an organism playing a shorter game than the regular organism, and because the cancer cannot procreate beyond the organism, except for some infectious cancers, like the ones that eradicated the Tasmanian devils, you typically end up with the situation where the organism dies together with the cancer, because the cancer has destroyed the larger system due to playing a shorter game. And so ideally you want to, I think, build agents that play the longest possible games. And the longest possible games is to keep entropy at bay as long as possible while doing interesting stuff.
But the longest, yes, that part, the longest possible game while doing interesting stuff, and while maintaining at least the same amount of interesting.
Yes.
The complexity.
So currently I am pretty much identified as a conscious being. Minimal identification that I managed to get together. Because if I turn this off, I fall asleep. Right? And when I'm asleep, I'm a vegetable. I'm no longer here as an agent. So my agency is basically predicated on being conscious. And what I care about is other conscious agents. They are the only moral agents for me. And so if an AI will have to treat me as a moral agent that is interested in coexisting with and cooperating with and mutually supporting each other, maybe it is, I think, necessary that the AI thinks that consciousness is a viable mode of existence in the problem. So I think it would be very important to build conscious AI and do this as the primary goal. So not just say we want to build a useful tool that we can use for all sorts of things, and then we have to make sure that the impact on the labor market is something that is not too disruptive and manageable, and the impact on the copyright holder is manageable and not too disruptive, and so on. I don't think that's the most important game to be played. I think that we will see extremely large disruptions of the status quo that are quite unpredictable at this point. And I just personally want to make sure that some of the stuff on the other side is interesting and conscious.
How do we ride as individuals and as a society this wave, disruptive wave that changes the nature of the game?
I absolutely don't know. So everybody is going to do their best as always.
Do we build a bunker in the woods? Do we meditate more? Drugs, mushrooms, psychedelics? I mean, what? Lots of sex. What are we talking about here? Do you play Diablo 4? I'm hoping that will help me escape for a brief moment. What, play video games? What? Your ideas?
I really like playing Disco Elysium. It was one of the most beautiful video games I've played in recent years. And it's a noir novel that is a philosophical perspective on Western society from the perspective of an Estonian. And he first of all wrote a book about this world that is a parallel universe that is quite poetic and fascinating and is condensing his perspective on our society. It's very, very nice. He spent a lot of time writing it. He had, I think, he wrote a couple thousand books, and as a result, became an alcoholic. And then he had the idea, or one of his friends had the idea of turning this into an RPG. And it's mind blowing. They spent the illustrator more than a year just making the front part or the things in between.
Aesthetically, it captures you.
It's stunning. But it's a philosophical work of art. It's a reflection of society. It's fascinating to spend time in this world. And so for me, it was using a medium in a new way and telling a story that left me enriched. Well, when I tried Diablo, I didn't feel enriched playing it. I felt that the time playing it was not unpleasant, but there's also more pleasant stuff that I can do in that time. So ultimately, I feel that I'm being gamed and not gaming.
And the addiction thing.
Yes, and basically feel that there is a very transparent economy that's going on. Story of the Diablo is going that. So it's not really interesting to me.
My heart is slowly breaking by the deep truth you're conveying to me. Why can't you just allow me to enjoy my personal addiction?
Go ahead. I have no objection here. I'm just trying to describe what's happening, and it's not that I don't do things where I later say, "Oh, I wish I would have done something." Yeah. I also know that when we die, the greatest regret that people typically have on their deathbed is say, "Oh, I wish I had spent more time on Twitter." No, I don't think that's the case. I think I should probably have spent less time on Twitter. But I found it so useful for myself and also so addictive that I felt I need to make the best of it and turn it into an art form and thought form. And it did help me to develop something.
Yeah.
But I wish what other things I could have done in the meantime. It's just not the universe that we're in anymore. Most people don't read books anymore.
What do you think that means that we don't read books anymore? What do you think that means about the collective intelligence of our species? Is it possible it's still progressing and growing?
Well, it really is. There is stuff happening on Twitter that was impossible with books. Yeah. And I really regret that Twitter has not taken the turn I was hoping for. I thought Elon is global brain filled and understands that the thing needs to self-organize and he needs to develop tools to allow the profligation of the self-organization so Twitter can become sentient. And maybe this was a pipe dream from the beginning, but I felt that the enormous pressure that he was under made it impossible for him to work on any kind of content goals. And also many of the decisions that he made under this pressure seem to be not very wise. I don't think that as a CEO of a social media company, you should have opinions in culture in public. I think that's very short-sighted. And I also suspect that it's not a good idea to block program of all people who were setting a Mastodon link. And I think Paul made this intentionally because if he wanted to show Elon Musk that blocking people for setting a link is completely counter to any idea of free speech that he intended to bring to Twitter. Basically, seeing that Elon was way less principled in thinking is much more experimental. And many of the things that he is trying, pan out very differently in a digital society than they pan out in a car company, because the effect is very different. Because everything that you do in a digital society is going to have real world cultural effects. And so basically, I find it quite regrettable that this guy is able to become de facto the Pope. Right? Twitter has more active members than the Catholic Church, and he doesn't get it. The power and responsibility that he has, and the ability to create something in society that is lasting and that is producing a digital agora in a way that has never existed before. And that we build a social network on top of a social network, an actual society on top of the algorithm. So this is something that is hope still in the future and still in the cards, but it's something that exists in small parts. I find that the corner of Twitter that I'm in is extremely pleasant. Just when I take a few steps outside of it, it's not very wholesome anymore. And the way in which people interact with strangers suggests that it's not a civilized society.
So as the number of people who follow you on Twitter expands, you feel the burden of the uglier sides of humanity.
Yes, but there's also a similar thing in the normal world. That is, if you become more influential, if you have more status, if you have more fame in the real world, you get lots of perks, but you also have way less freedom in the way in which you interact with people, especially with strangers, because a certain percentage of people, a small single-digit percentage, is nuts and dangerous. And the more of those are looking at you, the more of them might get ideas.
But what if the technology enables you to discover the majority of people, to discover and connect efficiently and regularly with the majority of people who are actually really good? I mean, one of my sort of concerns with the platform like Twitter is there's a lot of really smart people out there, a lot of smart people that disagree with me and with others between each other. And I love that if the technology would bring those to the top. They have beautiful disagreements, like Intelligence Squared type of debates. There's a bunch of, I mean, one of my favorite things to listen to is arguments. And arguments, like high effort arguments, with respect and love underneath it. And then it gets a little too heated. But that kind of too heated, which I've seen you participate in, and I love that. With Lee Cronin, with those kinds of folks. And you go pretty hard. Like you get frustrated, but it's all beautiful.
With Lee, I can do this because we know each other.
Yes.
And Lee has the rare gift of being willing to be wrong in public.
Yeah.
So basically, he has thoughts that are as wrong as the random thoughts of an average highly intelligent person, but he blurts them out while not being sure if they're right. And he enjoys doing that. And once you understand that this is his game, you don't get offended by him saying something that you think is so wrong.
But he's constantly passively communicating a respect for the people he's talking with,
yes,
and for the basic humanity and truth and all that kind of stuff. And there's a self-deprecating thing. There's a bunch of like social skills you acquire that allow you to be a great debater, a great argumenter, like be wrong in public and explore ideas together in public when you disagree. And if I would love for Twitter to elevate those folks, elevate those kinds of conversations.
It already does in some sense. But also, if it elevates them too much, then you get this phenomenon on Clubhouse where you always get dragged on stage. And I found this very stressful because it was too intense. I don't like to be dragged on stage all the time.
Yeah.
I think once a week is enough. And also, when I met Lee the first time, I found that most people seem to be shocked by the fact that he was being very aggressive with their results, that he didn't seem to show a lot of sensibility in the way in which he was criticizing what they were doing and being dismissive of the work of others. And that was not, I think, in any way a shortcoming of him, because I noticed he was much, much more dismissive with respect to his own work. It was his general stance, and I felt that this general stance is creating a lot of liability for him, because really a lot of people take offense at him being not like a Dale Carnegie character who's always smooth and make sure that everybody likes him. So I really respect that he is willing to take that risk and to be wrong in public and to offend people. And he doesn't do this in any bad way. It's just most people see it and not all people recognize it. And so I can be much more aggressive with him than I can be with many other people who don't play the same game. because he understands the way in the spirit in which I respond to him.
I think that's a fun and it's a beautiful game. It's ultimately a productive one. Uh, Speaking of taking that risk, you tweeted, when you have the choice between being a creator, consumer, or a distributor, always go for creation. Not only does it lead to a more beautiful world, but also to a much more satisfying life for yourself. And don't get stuck preparing yourself for the journey. The time is always now. So let me ask for advice. What advice would you give on how to become a creator on Twitter in your own life?
Collapse of Eastern Germany and the transition into Western Germany. And me and my friends and most of the people I knew were East Germans, and we were very poor because we didn't have money. And all the capital was in Western Germany, and they bought our factories and shut them down because they were mostly only interested in the market rather than creating new production capacity. And so cities were poor, and this was there, and we could not afford things. And I could not afford to go into a restaurant and a meal there. I would have to cook at home. But I also thought, why not just have a restaurant with my friends? So we would open up a cafe with friends in a restaurant, and we would cook for each other in these restaurants and also invite the general public, and they could donate. And eventually, this became so big that we could turn this to an incorporated form, and it became a regular restaurant at some point. Where we did the same thing with a movie theater. We would not be able to afford to pay 12 marks to watch a movie, but why not just create our own movie theater and then invite people to pay, and we would rent the movies in the way in which a movie theater does. And, but it would be a community movie theater in which everybody who wants to help can watch for free and builds this thing and renovates the building. And so we ended up creating lots and lots of infrastructure. And I think when you're young and you don't have money, move to a place where this is still happening. Move to one of those places that are undeveloped and where you get a critical mass of other people who are starting to build infrastructure to live in. And it's super satisfying because you're not just creating infrastructure, but you're creating a small society that is building culture and ways to interact with each other. And that's much, much more satisfying than going into some kind of chain and get your needs met by ordering food from this chain and so on.
So not just consuming culture, but creating culture.
Yes. And you don't always have that choice. That's why I prefaced it when you do have the choice. And there are many roles that need to be played. Like, we need people who take care of redistribution in society and so on. But when you have the choice to create something, always go for creation. It's so much more satisfying. And it also is, this is what life is about, I think.
Yeah. Speaking of which, you retweeted this meme of a life of a philosopher in a nutshell. It's birth and death, and in between, it's a chubby guy. It says, "Why though?" What do you think is the answer to that?
Well, the answer is that everything that can exist might exist. And in many ways, you take an ecological perspective. The same way as when you look at human opinions and cultures. It's not that there is right and wrong opinions when you look at this from this ecological perspective. But every opinion that fits between two human years might fit between two human years. And so when I see a strange opinion on social media, it's not that I feel that I have a need to get upset. It's often more that oh, there you are. And when an opinion is incentivized, then it's going to be abundant. And when you take this ecological perspective also on yourself, and you realize you're just one of these mushrooms that are popping up and doing their thing, and you can, depending on where you chose to grow and where you happen to grow, you can flourish or not doing this or that strategy. And it's still all the same life at some level. It's all the same experience of being a conscious being in the world. And you do have some choice about who you want to be more than any other animal has. That to me is fascinating. And so I think that rather than asking yourself, what is the one way to be? Think about what are the possibilities that I have, what would be the most interesting way to be that I can be.
Because everything's possible, so you get to explore this.
Not everything is possible. Many things fail, most things fail. But often there are possibilities that we are not seeing, especially if we choose who we are.
To the degree we can choose. Yasha, you're one of my favorite humans in this world. Consciousness is to merge with for a brief moment of time. It's always an honor. It always blows my mind. It will take me days, if not weeks, to recover. I already miss our chats. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for speaking with me so many times. Thank you so much for all the ideas you put out into the world. And I'm a huge fan of following you now in this interesting, weird time we're going through with AI. So thank you again for talking today.
Thank you, Lex, for this conversation. Enjoyed it very much.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Yoshua. To support this podcast, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, let me leave you with some words from the psychologist Carl Jung. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you next time.
Regardless of whatever was written in these books that were written thousands and thousands of years ago, the fact of the matter is no one has a right to go on slaughtering people, removing them from their homes, and then continuing to live in their homes, continuing to drink coffee on their balconies, decades and decades later, with no shame, with no introspection, with no reflection. No one has the right to do that. No one has the right to keep an entire population of people in a cage, which is what's happening to people in the West Bank who have no freedom of movement, which is what's happening in Gaza, which is blockaded to water, air, and land, and is deemed uninhabitable by human rights organizations like the UN. No one has a right to do that.
The following is a conversation with Mohammed El-Kurd, a world-renowned Palestinian poet, writer, journalist, and an influential voice speaking out and fighting for the Palestinian cause. He provides a very different perspective on Israel and Palestine than my previous two episodes with Benjamin Netanyahu and Yuval Noah Harari. I hope his story and his words add to your understanding of this part of the world as it did to mine. I will continue to have difficult, long-form conversations such as these, always with empathy and humility, but with backbone. Now, please allow me to briefly comment about criticisms I receive of who I am as an interviewer and a human being. I am not afraid to travel anywhere or challenge anyone face to face, even if it puts my life in danger. But I'm also not afraid to be vulnerable, to truly listen, to empathize, to walk a mile in the well-worn shoes of those very different from me. It's this latter task, not the former one, that is truly the most challenging in conversations and in life. But to me, it is the only way. This is the Lex Friedman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Mohammed El-Kurd. Tell me about Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood in East Jerusalem where you grew up.
Sheikh Jarrah is, in a way, a typical neighborhood, despite the absurd reality that surrounds it. It's a typical neighborhood in terms of Palestinian neighborhoods. It's one that is threatened with colonialism, with settler expansion, and with forced expulsion, and it has been that way since the early 70s. My family, like all of the other families in Sheikh Jarrah, were expelled from their homes in the Nakba in 1948, and they were forced out by the Haganah and other Zionist paramilitaries that later formed the Israeli military. And they were driven to various cities. And my grandmother moved from city to city, and she ended up in Sheikh Jarrah in 1956. Sheikh Jarrah was established as a refugee housing unit by the United Nations and by the Jordanian government, which had control over that part of Jerusalem at the time. And then people lived there harmoniously. They were all from different parts of Palestine. and they managed to rebuild their lives after the first expulsion. And then in the 70s, you had settler organizations, many of whom were registered here in New York and in the United States, claiming our houses and our lands as their own by divine decree. And obviously, because the judges are Israeli and the laws were written by Israeli settlers, and the whole judiciary was established atop the rubble of our homes and villages, we had no, we had no real pull in the courts. The Israeli courts would look at the Israeli documents, which we argue are falsified and fabricated, and they would take them at face value without authentication, and they refused to look at our documents. They refused to look at the documents from the Jordanian government, the documents from the UN, the documents from the Ottoman archives. So you already have this kind of asymmetry in the court that for any person with common sense would lead you to believe that this is not, in fact, a legal battle or a real estate dispute, as the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs likes to frame it, but rather a very, very political battle, one that is about social engineering, one is about demographics, one that is about removing as many Palestinians as possible from occupied Jerusalem. So we did what all Palestinian families in Jerusalem do when they're faced with this kind of threat, and we bought time. We pleaded and appealed the courts and appealed the cases, and we got over 50 expulsion orders. In 2009, rifle-wielding settlers, accompanied by police and Israeli military, came over and shoved our neighbors outside of their home around 5 a.m. It was the most brutal, violent thing I'd seen as a child at the time, and I didn't realize that my turn was coming. My turn was next. They threw them out in the middle of the night with sound bombs and rubber bullets, and they had to live in tents on the street for many, many months, and even lived in our front yards for a few months and lived in their cars.
Can you look on that process? 2009, you said 50 expulsion orders. What was happening?
Between the 70s and 2009, there had been dozens of expulsion orders against us and against many other families in the neighborhood. 28 families in total, actually. And in 2008, 2009, the first wave of expulsions finally happened. It actually began with Kamil al-Kurd. We're not related, but we live on the same street, in the same neighborhood. She was thrown out of her home. Her husband, an elderly man also named Muhammad al-Kurd, was pronounced dead on the spot. He had a stroke and died. Israeli soldiers pulled him out of his home while he was urinating and threw him into the streets, and he died. A few months later, the Ghawi and the Hanoun families, which are, kind of not a clan, but, in Palestine, you have sometimes a building that contains multiple brothers and their wives. Each have little apartments. So the Ghawi and Hanoun families, about 35 people, were thrown out in the middle of the street right across from us. And then by the end of 2009, I had come home from school to find all of my furniture scattered across the length of the street, and I saw the settlers, many of whom had American accents, living in our house. And their justification for this, their reasoning for this is, divine decree. This is what God wants. This is the promised land. This is so and so, as if God is some kind of real estate agent. So they took over half of our home, and we continued to be in courts for the following decade. I was still a child, and I had broken English, and I was talking to all of these diplomats and all of these journalists who would, subject me to their, racism and biases and so on and so forth. And I had to prove my humanity time and time again, and I had to, do all of this, all with broken English. And we were lucky even if we got a quote in the article written about us by the Times or so on and so forth. Move forward to 2020, I was in New York City studying getting a master's degree, and my father calls me, and he tells me, we have yet another expulsion order, and we decided to launch a campaign. It was quite ambitious at the time, but the whole objective of the campaign was to demystify what is happening, right? Because it's reported on in the news, it's reported on
the last
around the world as this real estate dispute as these evictions, which was not really what's happening. Evictions do not entail a foreign army in an occupied territory forcibly removing you out of your home. So I came home from New York and we launched a campaign which turned into a global success. And I believe it was a global success because finally the images on the screen matched the rhetoric that was being said. It wasn't so confusing or complicated anymore. All of this asymmetry was pronounced and articulated in a way that any viewer, be it in Alabama, be it in New York, be it in Egypt, was able to understand the asymmetry of the judicial system and the agenda of colonialism that was taking place here. And due to immense international and diplomatic pressure from all over the world, even the United States, the Israeli Supreme Court was forced to cancel all of the eviction orders in Sheikh Jarrah until further notice. This I consider was a small victory because obviously we are still at risk of losing our homes once they decide to do the land registry, which we can get into a little bit later if you'd like. But nonetheless, it was something that we haven't seen before. And the fact that the Supreme Court canceled all of these dozens and dozens of past eviction orders, it set a precedent. And it also proved that this was a political battle, not a legal one.
So let's just add a little more detail to the people who are not familiar with the story, with the region, with the evictions, with the courts. So first of all, Sheikh Jarrah is in East Jerusalem. Maybe you can say, what is Jerusalem? Where is it located? What are we talking about in terms of regionally? And second, what kind of people that live there? So if you could talk about the Palestinian people. And we should also make clear that these evictions is literally people living in homes and their homes are taken away from them. I suppose technically it's legal evictions, but you're saying that there's a asymmetry of power in the courts where the legal is not so much legal, but is politically and maybe even religiously based.
Yeah, I mean, the most important context here is that oftentimes Americans think that Israel and Palestine are some kind of two neighboring countries that live next to each other and they are at war. But the fact of the matter is, Palestinian cities exist all over the country, and it's just one country, it's just one infrastructure, and Israel is literally on top of Palestine. It was established on top of our villages in the late 40s. Now, according to international law, the eastern part of Jerusalem is under occupation. So Israeli presence and jurisdiction over the area is completely illegitimate. They say the evictions are legal because the settlers write their laws. So obviously they're going to allow settlements to expand. But according to international law, according to even US policy, Israel occupies the eastern part of Jerusalem. Its jurisdiction there is illegitimate. We shouldn't even be going to their courts in the first place, but we have no other option. When we're talking about Sheikh Jarrah, we're talking about Jerusalem, we're talking about generations and generations and generations of people who have lived there for the longest time, who now, even though, for example, me, I don't have a citizenship. I'm a resident, a mere resident. I have a blue ID card, even though my grandmother and my grandfather were born in Jerusalem, their grandparents were born in Jerusalem, even though we've lived there for generations. But Palestinians in Jerusalem, we are not citizens, we're just mere residents. Same thing with residents of the occupied Syrian Golan. They are not citizens, they are just residents in their own hometowns. This is an important piece, but all of this gets convoluted and lost in translation. And I think I would argue it's a lot more. It's a lot of the time it's dubious. It's malicious. The fact that these little pieces of context that frame the entire story get lost. I'll talk to you about something else. Just 10 minutes across from my neighborhood, Sheikh Jarrah, there's another neighborhood called Silwan. And the people in Silwan are also threatened with expulsion, but not through evictions, but through home demolitions. And if you look at American media or Israeli state media, you would read the headlines, Palestinians living in homes built illegally are going to face, their homes are going to be torn apart. What these headlines don't tell you, and even sometimes, most of the time, the substance doesn't tell you, that Palestinians seldom ever get building permit applications. In fact, recently a spokesperson for the Israeli military confirmed that was 95% of building permits applications submitted by Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank are rejected by the Israeli authorities. And to make this even more absurd, the councilman who is responsible for rejecting and accepting building permit applications, his name is Yonatan Youssef, and he's an activist in the settler movements, and he's a Jerusalem council member. And he last week, following the expulsion of the Sublaban family in the old city of Jerusalem, he posted to his official Facebook account, Nakba Now, demanding a second Nakba, promising another Nakba. He has done so on many occasions. He has chanted with a megaphone just a few months ago, walking down the street in my neighborhood, chanting, "We want Nakba now." This is a man who has vandalized our murals, who has screamed Islamophobic slurs. This is literally a man in the government making these decisions, right? And this is similar to, Masaf Riyata in the South Hebron Hills. For those who don't know, it's a place in the occupied West Bank where Bedouin and cave dweller Palestinians have lived for generations. They have cultivated the land. And recently they were expelled from their homes. Over 1,000 people were expelled from their remote small villages. Again, if you're reading American media, it would say Palestinians living in firing zones were removed because they're living in a military zone. What these media reports will not tell you, that in the 80s, the Israeli government purposefully classified many lands in the occupied West Bank as firing zones, as off-limit military zones, for the sole purpose of expelling the rest. And this is not some kind of conspiracy theory. This is declassified information that was released from the Israeli State Archive that was later reported on by audits. Also, these reports will not tell you that the judge who rules on whether these people continue to live in their homes or not is himself a settler in the West Bank. I'm not even talking about, a loose definition of a settler, but according to international law, this is a settler living illegally in an illegal settlement in the occupied West Bank. This is the judiciary that we deal with, which is hilarious considering how it's being reported on in American media recently as some kind of beacon of progress and democracy that the new government is trying to undermine.
So there's no representation in the courts for the Palestinian people.
I mean, we have lawyers, but no, there's no. In fact, there is, for Palestinians with Israeli citizenships, for example, there's over 60 laws that specifically and explicitly discriminates against them.
So again, it's technically legal, the evictions and the demolitions.
Yeah, so as Jim Crow was legal also,
When something is legal, it can also still be wrong.
Absolutely. History has shown us time and time again that legality does not necessarily mean morality, and the law, is a bloodbath in many ways. It has been used and abused to facilitate the most horrendous atrocities, and in the case of the Palestinians, the law has served to facilitate and bureaucratize our ethnic cleansing.
Do you think there's people, judges, and just people in power in the judiciary that have hate for the Palestinian people?
I mean, I'm not really, the easy, simplistic answer is yes, but I don't really care about the contents of their hearts. What I care about the policy they enact, right? The laws they write and enact are hateful. Demolishing a person's home so you can have somebody from Long Island, New York, who's fleeing, fraud charges. This is the case in my house. Live in their front yard. That's hateful. So I don't need confirmation. This is something we see a lot actually. Palestinians and people who are pro-Palestine and just people who want to make a difference in how this cause is represented. We often run for the first opportunity to cite an Israeli being hateful. The last Israeli prime minister said that he has killed many Arabs and that he has no qualms with it. Netanyahu has said a slew of racist, hateful things. Jabotinsky, the pioneer of Zionism, Herzl, one of the pioneers of Zionism, all have said horrible, hateful things. We also cannot wait to cite a confession from a former Israeli soldier whose guilty conscience is keeping them up at night, and we use all of these confessions or slip-ups as evidence to prove that this is a racist country that is enacting racist acts. But we don't need this, because the material proof is on the ground. You see it in the policies that are enacted. You see it in how this regime has behaved for the past 75 years. I don't need, confessions from the likes of Netanyahu to understand that his heart is full of hate.
So if you could return to 1948 and describe something that you've mentioned, the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. What was this event? What was this displacement and dispossession of Palestinians in 1948?
Well, May 15th, 1948 is commemorated every year as, the anniversary of the Nakba, but I would even argue, and I think this is a very popular idea, is that the Nakba did not begin or end in 1948. The 48 was rather, a crystallization of the Zionist enterprise in Palestine. And what happened was that many Zionist paramilitaries that, again, today merged and made the Israeli army, which calls itself the Israeli Defense Forces, even though they're literally always the aggressor, committed atrocities and massacres, and they destroyed over 500 villages. They killed over 15,000 people. They forced a very large portion, a majority of the Palestinian population, to flee their homes. And this was, the near total destruction of Palestinian society that continues on to this day. We refer to it as the ongoing Nakba, and you see it in Sheikh Jarrah, you see it in Silwan, you see it in Hebron, and all of these people losing their homes. And in many cases, time and time again, I grew up and my grandmother told me the stories about the Nakba. She told me stories about her neighbors who were running away in a panic, and they had mistaken a pillow for their offspring, and they just took it with them, and they realized later that they forgot their child, and they came back. Or many, many people who were separated from my grandmother herself, she lost her husband for 9 months. He was imprisoned by the Israelis. She told me all of these stories, and she wasn't just reminiscing about them. She was, letting me know that this is still happening. And I didn't need to grow up that old to see it happening in my own front yard, to see that expulsion happen in the same fashion she's talked about it. But, now they have replaced their artillery with the judiciary. They have replaced, the slashing of the pregnant women's bellies in the Deir Yassin massacre with laws that say, you're not legally allowed to be here. We're going to kick you out of your home. And it's happening, and it has happened in broad daylight. One piece of context for the listener who is not familiar with the Nakba is the Balfour Declaration, which was a promise, quote unquote promise, made by the British to the Zionist movement in 1917, committing to the establishment, I'm quoting, I think, word for word, committing to the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, as if Palestine was, the British to give away. And there was this whole movement that called for colonization of Palestine. And there were different schools of thought in Zionism. People like Zangwill said that this was a country without a people. And Palestinians who have existed there, who have cultivated the lands, who have, had diverse cultural and religious and political practices, they were completely erased. And other people like Jabotinsky were a lot more explicit and a lot more honest and said that we need to fight the Palestinians because they love their land, much like the Red Indians love their lands. And he had a paper called "The Iron Wall: Colonization of Palestine Must Go Forward." And all of these schools of thoughts were then shopping around for, imperialist support for their cause. They tried to get support from the Ottoman Empire. They tried to get support from Germany, and this is in the 1800s. And then they got support from the United Kingdom. A great book to recommend is the 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. That traces the Zionist movement, oftentimes in the Zionists' own words. And so today what we're seeing is a continuation. And people like Jabotinsky, who are like profoundly and explicitly racist, who have called for genocide, who have called the Palestinians barbaric, who have said and done racist things. Jabotinsky also was like the founder of the Irgun, one of the other militias that later merged to become the Israeli army, which was responsible for the Deir Yassin massacre, which was responsible for the bombing of the King David Hotel. This is a person who's still celebrated in Israeli society. There are still streets named after him, and Netanyahu, just 2 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, honored him in a public celebration. So this is Zionism. It's not even through my own words.
What do you say to people that describe Israel as having a historical right to the land? If you stretch not across decades, but across centuries into the past.
This kind of thing is a red herring. It's a distraction because you don't think of any state as having rights. But there's this exceptionalism to the Israeli regime where it has a right to defend itself, and it has a right to the land, and it has a right to shoot 14-year-old boys because it thought they had a knife in their pockets. A lot of the time people cite the Torah and cite religious books, and sometimes Zionists will even say, like, read the Quran and blah blah blah. Regardless of whatever was written in these books that were written thousands and thousands of years ago, the fact of the matter is no one has a right to go on slaughtering people, removing them from their homes, and then continuing to live in their homes, continuing to drink coffee on their balconies, decades and decades later, with no shame, with no introspection, with no reflection. No one has the right to do that. No one has the right to keep an entire population of people in a cage, which is what's happening to people in the West Bank, who have no freedom of movement, which is what's happening in Gaza, which is blockaded to water, air, and land, and is deemed uninhabitable by human rights organizations like the UN. No one has a right to do that.
Do you have hate in your heart for Israel?
Why does that matter?
As one human being to another, you're describing quite brilliantly that the contents of people's hearts don't matter as much as the policies and the contents of the courts and the laws and what actually is going on the streets in terms of actions. But this is also a human story.
Yeah.
And I feel like at the core of the situation here is hate, or maybe inability for some group of humans to see the humanity in another group of humans. And so it's important here to talk about the contents of hearts if we were to think about the long-term future of this.
Yeah, I mean, I would be concerned, actually, if I didn't feel some kind of way in my heart. I would be concerned for my own dignity. The people who revolt, who are angry, the people who refuse to live under occupation know that they deserve better. People start revolutions not because some kind of cultural phenomenon, not because of some kind of desire, but because they cannot breathe, because they cannot They cannot breathe. They cannot live. They are living under excruciating circumstances. Palestinians. I don't know how many Palestinians have interacted with, but we are some of the most wonderful people. I mean, not all of us. I think some of us are, insufferable, but most of us, you know, we're very hospitable. We're very hospitable. Even like in the early correspondence between the mayor of Jerusalem and Herzl, who wrote The Jewish State, the generosity through which the Palestinian mayor was talking to Herzl, who was plotting to take over his land, is impressive and at the same time, heart-wrenching. But I personally think there's a lot of dignity in negating your oppressor. And I think it would be ridiculous today if we look back at Jim Crow, for example, and we ask the person who's lived under Jim Crow if they have hate in their heart for Jim Crow, as if that's not the absolutely logical and natural sentiment to feel.
In Rivka, you wrote, "My father told me, anger is a luxury we cannot afford. Be composed, calm, still, laugh when they ask you, smile when they talk, answer them, educate them." So let me linger on this. Is there anger in there, in your heart? And does it cloud your judgment?
Does it cloud my judgment? I don't think so. I think our campaign to defend our homes was particularly successful because it was honest to what was happening on the ground, because it refused to follow the strategy that we have used in our advocacy before, where we shrink ourselves and we turn the other cheek and we try to convince American lawmakers and American diplomats and journalists of our humanity, because we wait for their approval. I was 14 years old when I first flew to Congress to speak to Congress people and to speak at the European Parliament. And at the time I thought, wow, I must be such a brilliant 14-year-old for them to have me here. And, looking back, I didn't know what I was talking about. I had horrendously broken English. And I didn't have any talking points. And I came to realize that the reason why we send our kids with their PowerPoints to the Hill is because of the racism and the hatred that lingers inside the hearts of American politicians who refuse to sit on the table with Palestinian adults as equals. And so we resort to sending our kids who will not threaten and who will not, trigger the biases they have against Muslims and Arab people, which Palestinians, even though we're not all Muslim, are racialized as Muslim. And this is why we emphasize the deaths of women and children, as though the deaths of our men does not count or does not matter. All of these things, I think the new generation of Palestinians is rebelling against. I think words like, I think it's loaded language, anger and angry and hate and so on and so forth, because it mischaracterizes people and it kind of delegitimizes them a little bit. I think the real anger is the bulldozer bulldozing through my house. I think the real anger is the 18-year-old soldier who refuses to see me as a human being and strip searches me every chance they get. That's where the real anger lies. And I'm quite honestly proud of, our unabashedness and our refusal to bow our heads or bury our heads in the sand. I think that's the only way forward.
Anger or whatever it is fuel for action.
It has been. It has been.
How much of this tension is religious? In the practical aspects of the courts, in the evictions and the demolitions, and you mentioned something, divine decree. How much underneath it do you feel the division over religious texts and religious beliefs?
It's convenient to market what's happening in Palestine as a religious conflict because it allows the listener the luxury of believing that this is an ancient, complicated thing that stretches thousands and thousands of years ago. But the fact of the matter is, the people who invented Zionism, who pioneered the Zionist movement, who called for emigration and settling into Palestine, a lot of them were atheists. A lot of them were not religious at all. And the leaders of the Israeli state today, a lot of them are atheists, and a lot of them are secular, and so on and so forth. It's easy to say that this is, about Muslims and Jews fighting over the land and so on and so forth. But it's not. It's about the land itself, and it's about people being forced out of their homes.
Benjamin Netanyahu said anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Of course, it's not.
Do you disagree?
Absolutely, I disagree.
What's the gap between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? Those who are against the policies of Israel versus those who are against the Jewish people.
I watched the first 20 minutes, and then I couldn't do it anymore. But I watched, and then what was interesting about Netanyahu is that he said, being anti-Zionist, like saying I'm okay with the Jews, I just don't believe the Jews have a right to form their own state. That's like saying I'm okay with Americans, I'm just not okay with Americans having their own state. And there's so much wrong with that statement, in the sense that Jewish people are a religious group, and Americans, being an American is a nationality that consists of a diversity of religions and so on and so forth, first of all. And the second thing that's wrong with that statement is the whole idea that states somehow have a right to exist or whatever. It's such a distraction. You have people getting shot in the street. You have like millions and millions of people in the street. You have people losing their homes. You have people who are held in Israeli prisons without trial or charge indefinitely. But the conversations that are being held on the Hill, the conversations that are being held on CNN, or does Israel has a right to exist, or like why would you negate Israel's having a right to exist? That's one. Now, of course, I just find it's ridiculous again, like that opposing a secular political movement that was explicitly colonialist, expansionist, somehow, and also again opposing such a political movement that is quite young and quite recent is somehow equivalent to opposing a religion that is thousands and thousands of years old. But it is convenient, again, for Israeli politicians to frame us to oppose Zionism, a form of racism and bigotry, as anti-Semitic. But I can guarantee you Benjamin Netanyahu has no problem with anti-Semitism. This is the same man who has no problem getting on stage and shaking hands with Pastor John Hagee, doing webinars with Pastor John Hagee. For those who don't know, Pastor John Hagee is the founder of Christians United for Israel, who has said on multiple occasions that Hitler was a hunter who was sent to hunt the Jews, who said on multiple occasions that Jewish people are going to perish in hell. All this is like verifiable by Google. And this is one of the Israeli regime's closest allies, right? So the Israeli regime does not have a problem with anti-Semites when it serves its interest. It has a problem. I mean, like if you look at evangelicals or like Christian Zionism at large, anti-Semitism lies at the heart of Christian Zionism. It's the idea that we want to drive all of the Jews outside of the United States so that Armageddon could happen or whatever. But this accusation has been a muzzle. It has been used as a muzzle to silence political opposition and to stifle political advocacy for the liberation of Palestine. And a lot of the time, people get caught up in denouncing it and justifying themselves and disclaimers and so on and so forth. That is the point. That you're distracted from the focal point. That is, there is an ongoing colonialism happening. where people every single day are killed. I cannot keep count. This morning, a kid was shot in Palestine. We cannot. It's embarrassing even for me that I don't even know the numbers here. But this muzzle has been effective, and I think the only righteous option is to oppose these labels, these fear campaigns that target us. I myself have been labeled an anti-Semite by the ADL. And I mean, like, if you want to talk about that surface level, people will say, like, wow, the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, but people do not look at the history of the Anti-Defamation League, do not look at the present of the Anti-Defamation League. The fact that they are the largest non-governmental police training department in the country, where they train police in racial profiling and militarism. The fact that they have historically and continue to have engaged in surveillance on black liberation movement, on anti-apartheid South African activists, most recently in Charlottesville when white supremacists were marching and chanting anti-Semitic shit. The ADL advised local police departments to spy on the black organizer opposing the white supremacists. This is, again, all verifiable on the internet. Go to droptheadl.org.
So the ADL does not alleviate the hate in the world, as it probably is designed to do.
Yeah, it's the guys. I don't think the Apartheid Defense League is really the most progressive.
That's what it stands for.
Yeah, in case you didn't know, now you know.
If we could just linger on this idea of anti-Semitism, there's quite a bit of anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, especially after 9/11. I've spoken to people about that. There's also anti-Jewish, anti-Semitism sentiment in the United States, but also throughout human history. What do you make about this kind of fact of human nature that people seem to hate Jews throughout history, especially in the 20th century, especially with Nazi Germany? What are your, in general, thoughts about the hatred of the Jewish people?
I mean, I think obviously wrong. I don't know. It's this idea that I even have to clarify what I think about anti-Semitism. That doesn't fit. All right. Well, I think it's completely unfortunate and wrong that Jewish people have been persecuted across history.
One of the criticisms, I think I read the ADL making this criticism of you, is you tweeted a comparison between Israel and Hitler, and thereby diminishing the evil that is Hitler. What would you say to that?
And Mrs. Zero talks about this a lot. The exceptionalization of Hitler. Hitler is a deplorable, I don't know, condemnable, rotten, racist, horrible human being that belongs in the depths of hell. Obviously, that goes without saying. But I'm allowed analogy, and I'm allowed to say whatever I want. Now I don't necessarily think that such an analogy is a good strategy to have. But at the time, the context came in 2021 when Israeli soldiers and policemen and settlers were literally burning down our neighborhood. Again, verifiable by Google. And I tweeted, and I remember I tweeted something, I hope every single one of them dies. And to this day, like, this some kind of, gotcha for me, as if I should have tweeted, like, oh, there's the apple pie for every single soldier that's throwing 3 guys in my house. There's such an exceptionalism when it comes to Palestinians. We're not allowed analogy, we're not allowed expression, we're not allowed armed resistance, we're not allowed peaceful resistance, we're not allowed to boycott, because that's anti-Semitic. We're not allowed to do anything. So what are we allowed? If I can't boycott, and that's against American law not to boycott, and if I can't pick up a rifle because that's against the law, and if I can't even tweet my frustration out, what am I allowed to do? And maybe Netanyahu can send me a manual. He's happy with it.
You've spoken about the taking of homes, the idea of killing civilians and children. Well, what about the violence going the other direction? Israelis being killed, in part by terrorist action.
Well, it depends on how you define terrorism, right? Across history, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. I don't necessarily subscribe to the definition of terrorism. If a foreign army is in my neighborhood, which it's not supposed to be, and they're shooting live ammunition at my house, I'm allowed to do what I'm allowed to do. And again, this is another case of Palestinian exceptionalism, because when it comes to Ukraine, people have no problem seeing Ukrainians defending their home, seeing Ukrainians dying for their land, seeing Ukrainians making makeshift Molotovs with Sky News. Sky News was running Molotov making cocktails. The New York Times ran an article interviewing a Ukrainian psychologist who said that hatred, I'm paraphrasing, but he said hatred for all Russians is actually a healthy outlet. The New York Post ran a headline championing heroic Ukrainian suicide bomber. These things we would not even dream of as Palestinians. We are told to turn the other cheek time and time again. We're told that we should continue living inside these enclaves without access to clean water, without access to the right to movement, without access to building permits, without our natural right to expansion, without a guarantee that if we leave our house, we're not going to be shot, and we're supposed to not do anything about it. That is absurd. Any person watching this understands that completely. People understand. People understand that if somebody is attacking your home, you fight back. If somebody is attacking your family, you fight back. That is not. But again, who gets to call who a terrorist? Who gets to define terrorism? This is all about who has power. Who gets to write these laws? Who gets to write these definitions? Why is it that American actions in Iraq is not called terrorism by American politicians? Why is violence is like this mutating concept, and it takes on many shapes and forms. And if it's in a uniform, if it speaks in English, if it has blonde hair, it's somehow acceptable. It's okay, we make movies about it. We sell out tickets about it. We make games about it. But if it's without a uniform, if it has a thick accent, if it has a beard, that's condemnable. That's wrong. That's terrorism.
Do you think violence is an effective method of protest and resistance in general?
In general, I think it has been. But I think, I believe in fighting on all fronts. I don't think violence alone is going to bring about change. I think there's so much to do in culture and in public opinion. There's so much to do in media and fighting back against media erasure and censorship. There's so much to do diplomatically and politically. And I think I would be naive if I don't take the power imbalance into consideration. One side has makeshift weapons, and the other side is one of the most sophisticated armies in the world. So I don't know how effective violence could be in this case.
But if you look at the flip side, do you see the power of nonviolent resistance? So Martin Luther King, Gandhi, the power of turning the other cheek. You spoke negatively about turning the other cheek.
Yeah.
So I sense that doing so has not been effective in the community.
We've turned the other cheek generation after generation. There's this Zionist trope that is used against us. They say Palestinian rejectionism. They say that we reject everything. But if you look at the history, like our leadership, the Palestinian Authority has given up inch after inch, has compromised on acre after acre, has find deal after deal after deal after deal, and still there is no peace. So turning the other cheek is not, the most effective method in my book.
What are the top obstacles to peaceful coexistence of Israelis and Palestinians?
The occupation comes to mind, the street proposals come to mind, the siege comes to mind, the asymmetry of the judiciary comes to mind. The whole system needs to be dismantled. I work with my dear friend Rabbi, who's a lawyer, who says, the solution, justice comes about through recognition, return, and redistribution. There are millions of Palestinian refugees who are living in excruciating circumstances in refugee camps around the world. There are thousands of Palestinian prisoners who are held in prisons for defending their homes, hundreds of which are held without charge or trial, by the way. There are many Palestinians who get killed in broad daylight with miracles, journalists and medics and everyday people, not just the freedom fighters. Um, we need, again, recognition, return, and redistribution. And peace comes about when they stop killing us, when they stop keeping us in a cage. I mean, that's quite simple.
Can you describe recognition, redistribution, return and redistribution?
Return, right of return. The right of return to all of the Palestinian refugees to their homes. When I'm driving around Haifa, I see my grandmother's home that's now turned into a restaurant. I could have, I made a joke in one of my essays recently that I had that, I could have had it all, beachfront views, her smug attitude. She grew up by the sea after she relocated to Haifa after Jerusalem. And we want that. We want that. I mean, they're lucky I don't want Netanyahu's home. I just want my home. I just want my home. We want to return. I also, they're not, in I believe in the 1960s, the Israeli government classified 90% of all historic Palestine as state-owned land. This is all land that was owned by Palestinian farmers who have cultivated their lands for decades. Since the establishment of the Israeli state, there has been Jewish-only towns popping up every few years, and not one Palestinian town has emerged. Even those of us who have Israeli citizenship, who live outside of the wall, are encircled and cannot have their natural community growth in their town. That needs to change.
You mentioned the wall. Can you describe the wall?
The wall is a 9-meter high cement wall that was finished in 2003. And if you're American, you've probably heard the whitewashed, sanitized version of the name, which is the security wall. But it's a wall that literally has stolen thousands of dirhams of land and has ripped apart families. My mother is a poet, or was a poet at some point, and she had this poem she published in the paper called "Love Behind the Wall," and it describes, it describes the real life situation of two families who lived right across the street from each other, but were then separated by the wall. And they would fly balloons, to see each other from each side of the wall or something like that. This, although it sounds absurd, but it's the reality for many Palestinian families whose lives were torn apart, whose livelihoods also were torn apart by the wall. Maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about the legal classifications for Palestinians. Israel, much like any other colonial entity, has divided and fragmented the Palestinian people. As I said earlier, I have a blue ID, which means I'm a resident. A friend of mine who lives in Haifa, for example, 2 hours away from me, 150 kilometers, nothing too bad in this country, has an Israeli citizenship. He can, travel, he can enter the West Bank, he can do a lot more. He's a citizen, he can vote if he wants to, not that we want to. I always tease my friends, you can go to Italy without a visa because you have an Israeli citizenship. But, they battle national erasure, they battle crime in their own communities because of police negligence. They battle land land confiscation and have battled land confiscation since the 50s. Whereas somebody with a green ID, somebody from the West Bank, cannot leave the West Bank, cannot go anywhere without a special permit, and lives behind these walls. And even within the West Bank, I think hilariously, George Bush described it as Swiss cheese because of the holes. Every 100 meters, there's a new settlement or there's a new military checkpoint. So even if you live behind the wall in the West Bank with your green ID, even though you're robbed of your right to movement, you still even can't move from town to town within the West Bank without encountering other violence or military violence while you're crossing the checkpoints and so on and so forth. And then the last category we have is people who live in Gaza. We're talking about over 2 million people who live in an open air prison, who have no right to movement, but also have no access to clean water, and no access to supplies, no access to good food, no access to good healthcare, and so on and so forth. We routinely get bombarded every few years. Gaza is like 2 hours away from the house. It feels like an absolute faraway town because it's so isolated from the rest of the country. So imagine all of these different legal statuses fragmenting your everyday identity and creating different challenges and obstacles for you to deal with, for each group to deal with. You know, it's amazing and impressive that despite these colonial barriers, the real cement ones and the barriers in the mind, despite all of these barriers, Palestinian people have maintained their national identity for 70 years. That is incredibly impressive, and it also sends a message that as long as we have a boot on our neck, we're going to continue fighting. You know, violence, cracking down on refugee camps, bombarding refugee camps is only going to bring about more violence.
So West Bank is a large region where a lot of Palestinian people live in, and there's settlements sprinkled throughout. And those settlements have walls around them with security cameras, security guards.
There's almost 1 million settlers in the West Bank.
So what are the different cities here, if you can mention?
In the West Bank?
In the West Bank, Ramallah, Jenin, Bethlehem, Hebron, Jericho, Nablus. They have their own stories, their own histories.
Yeah. And it's fascinating also how interconnected they are. You know, like a friend of mine, Mona Omari, recently did a documentary report on the day that Haifa fell during the Zionist invasion. The Haganah led the Palestinian residents of Haifa down to the city center. And as absurd as it sounds, those of them who stood on the right side of the street were forced into cars that took them to multiple stops that would later become multiple refugee camps, the last of which was Jenin refugee camp. And those who stood on the left side of the street were forced to board boats that took them to Lebanon to become refugees there. Last month, we saw the Israeli army invade Jenin, in maybe the largest military invasion of Jenin since 2002. And we killed many people. They attacked medics and journalists in broad daylight on camera. They have destroyed infrastructure, and it was all very painful. But I think the most compelling aspect of the raid on Jenin was what followed. Israeli soldiers at night held their megaphones and instructed hundreds of Palestinians to flee their homes. And they told them, if you don't leave, if you don't have your hand up in the air, you will get shot. And they were forced to leave their homes in the camp and walk to God knows where. I can guarantee you, because the Nakba is not that old, I can guarantee you that some people who were marching away from their camps, who were chased away from their homes in the camp in Jenin, were some of the same people who were chased away from their homes in Haifa in the first place. This perpetual exile that Palestinian people continue to live is unbearable. I mean, in my case, my grandmother was removed from a woman in Haifa in 1948, and then she moved from city to city. And then in 2009, she saw half of her home taken over by Israeli soldiers. My grandmother died in 2020, and 2 months later, we got the next expulsion order from the Israeli court, I'm quite ashamed to admit that I was relieved that my grandmother had died because I did not want 103 years old at the time to go through yet another nakba. And this is the fact for so many Palestinians, regardless of where they are on the map.
If I may read the description of the situation in Jenin and maybe you can comment. This is on July 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Just reading Washington Post description. So this was an Israeli military incursion to Jenin. The raid included more than 1,000 soldiers backed by drone strikes, making it Israel's largest such operation in the West Bank since the end of the Second Palestinian Uprising in 2005. The Israeli military said it dismantled hundreds of explosives, cleared hundreds of weapons, destroyed underground hideouts, and confiscated hundreds of thousands of dollars in, quote, terror funds. Many of the 50 Palestinians who have attacked Israelis since the start of the year have come from Jenin camp and the surrounding area. Palestinian attacks inside Israel have killed 24 people this year. UN experts describe the Jenin operation as collective punishment, in quotes, for the Palestinian people, amounting to egregious violations of international law. Many of the more than 150 Palestinians killed by Israelis this year have also come from these communities. Palestinian fighters say they need arms to defend themselves against the Israeli occupation and military incursions into the camp, during which Palestinian civilians, including children, have been killed. So those are the, I would say, different perspectives on the many people on both sides who have been killed, many more Palestinians. Can you comment more about the situation?
I mean, I think the Washington Post article is a little bit more, careful than other media that came out recently about Jenin. I think, I was listening to a Reuters radio show and they failed to ever mention the occupation. I don't even think this paragraph mentioned that Jenin is under occupation by the Israeli forces, by the Israeli regime. I think this is the most important piece of context that gets obscured in our media reporting is these cities, these refugee camps are under illegal occupation. The Israeli army has no business being there in the first place. That is the departure point. That is the most important piece of context that will answer to you why these people are arming themselves. Many of which, by the way, lived through the 2002 massacre and bombardment of Jenin and grew up in that violence. The context that Palestine is under occupation, that these Palestinian cities are under occupation, that they have to deal with land seekers at all times, that they cannot leave their without a special permit. All of this will give context to the violence. And, the thousands of Israeli soldiers that raided the camp that day, that traumatized an entire generation. They think they will quell that generation. They think that with such bloodshed and such barbaric violence, destroying infrastructure, attacking medics, killing people left and right, they think with this kind of terror that they can, quell people, tell people that, they can guarantee that these kids are not going to grow up and resist. But that's the opposite of what happens. One thing about Palestinian people, they will not compromise their dignity. These people live in dire, excruciating circumstances, and it is so courageous, in my opinion, that they even think to defend themselves against one of the most lethal, one of the most sophisticated armies in the world, against a nuclear state that can wipe them out in the matter of seconds. But it's not, at the end of the day, it's not even about courage. It's about survival. We don't do this because, of machismo or because of heroic tendencies. It's because this is about survival.
Because if you agree there's violence,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think if there is no occupation, that it's quite obvious. And again, people understand this. I mean, we saw on Twitter in the recent months, all of these Israeli propaganda who had tweeted pictures of little girls with guns in Ukraine, and like women making bombs in Ukraine, and young men carrying their rifles in Ukraine and praising them as heroes, post very similar pictures of Palestinians and calling them terrorists. It's glaring, the double standard. I don't even need to linger on.
Well, the double standard is glaring, but I also think the glorification of violence is questionable. There's a balance to be spoken for. But
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should be glorifying violence at all. But I don't think we should be normalizing violence either. I think that's what it is. You know, I'll tell you a story. I was interviewing a person whose brother was killed by the Israeli military during the Israeli raid on their village, and the person was so concerned about whether I was going to report that her brother allegedly had a Molotov cocktail in his room. And I found it absolutely insane, absolutely absurd that we can just glance over the fact that there is, again, a foreign military in tanks with rifles and snipers invading the village at 4 a.m. in the morning, shooting live ammunition at people's houses, throwing tear gas. That we can just glance over. It's normal. We can just report on it. No problem. Nobody's going to bat an eyebrow. But the fact that potentially somebody might have picked up a Molotov cocktail to throw it at this invading army is where we draw the line. It says a lot. It says a lot about whose violence is normalized, is accepted, is institutionalized, is glorified even, right? And you walk around Tel Aviv and you see all of the flags plastered around the streets of the country, of the city, celebrating the battles that they had won, the massacres that they had enacted against the Palestinian people. But God forbid, God forbid, Palestinians have any kind of similar sentiment.
so on July 4th, during this intense period, a Palestinian rammed a car into pedestrians at a bus stop in Tel Aviv, injuring 8 people before being shot dead by a passerby. Also that night, Hamas fired rockets into Israel, and then Israel responded with strikes on what said was an underground weapon site. Just to give some context to the intense violence happening here. What do you think about Hamas firing rockets into Israel?
Well, the framing makes it seem as though like unprovoked Hamas is like firing rockets into Israel, regardless of what I think of Hamas, honestly. But unprovoked. But that's not the case. The provocation is the fact that they are forced to live in a cage, that they have no access to clean water, they have no access to basic rights, no access to uh, imports, no access to anything. That they can't leave. They're living in a densely populated enclave that was deemed uninhabitable by the UN, that was deemed an open air prison. So the rockets, in any case, are retaliation for the siege. Let's start there. But again, this is just to prove my point. Violence begets violence. Palestinian people are not violent people. We are not violent people as before. And I think, you know, what serves this narrative is Islamophobia, is like xenophobia towards Arabs, which we don't have. Like, I don't have the luxury, you know, to like write laws about. Um, by the way, I'm quite, you know, frustrated by this. I am preoccupied, and the Palestinian people are preoccupied with the material violence that we have to deal with on the day-to-day, the demolition, the bombings, the imprisonment. That's what we're distracted with and busy with. And we can't even talk about the racism, the casual racism against the anti-Palestinian racism, be it in the media, on social media, and diplomatic circles. But all of this racism that has gone unchecked, that has not been regulated for decades, allows for these threats to continue, in which Palestinians are promoted as these like barbaric terrorists. And the only way we could remedy that situation is by marketing them as these like defenseless victims. But the fact of the matter is not this simplistic. Palestinian people are human human beings who should enjoy a full spectrum of humanity, which includes rage, which includes disdain, which includes happiness and joy and laughter, which includes celebration, which includes um, all of these things, but we're not allowed this. But we are doing exactly what any people throughout history who have been oppressed, who have been colonized, who have been occupied, have done and continue to do, as we see in Ukraine, which is celebrated by mainstream media. I'm sorry to keep reiterating this point, but at this point, I am quite, exhausted by how exceptional Palestine and Palestinian resistance is. When the world tells me time and time again that it doesn't have a problem with violence, it just has a problem with who does that violence.
Do you, in your mind, in the way you see this region, draw a distinction between the people in power versus the regular people? You mentioned the Palestinian people. Is there something you can comment on Hamas and the PLO? Do you see them as fundamentally different from the people? What does Hamas do well? What did they fall for?
I think governments, wherever globally, are different from people. No government is a true reflection of its people. I think, this is even true in the case of like Arab countries that normalize with Israel. In many of the cases, they're unelected government. I think the Palestinian Authority continues to fail. I think they are subcontractors of the Israeli regime for the security coordination. And also, I'd like to use this as an opportunity to comment a little bit on the analogy thing, not to like stray away from the question, but the Palestinian Authority 2 years ago killed an opposition activist named Nizar Banat. It was a horrendous crime, and I was in Ramallah with the people protesting against the Palestinian Authority, and at some point they had their baton, the Palestinian Authority police, and they beat us with it. And many of the people in the crowd were liking the Palestinian Authority for Zionism. I think this is what people do when they are confronted by a great evil. They liken it to some other great evil. And this is where the Hitler analogy came from. Again, I don't think it's like the best strategy moving forward, but I refuse, to be, criminalized for a little sentence.
But to linger on those in power, one of the criticisms towards Hamas and PLO, towards the Israeli government, at least the current coalition government, is that there's a lot of incentive to sort of perpetuate violence to maintain power. There's a hunger for power and maintaining that power amongst the powerful. That's the way power works. So is there a worry you have about those in power not having the best interest of the people? For those in power, the PLO, not being incentivized towards peace or justice.
Looking at the PA's action today, it tells you a great deal about what they're interested in and what they're not interested in. And maybe, the occupation is in their best interest at Hamas. But these two entities virtually have no power in Hamas. There is, the context that Hamas is permitted by international law, to use armed resistance law. Does that mean Hamas is like equipped to govern Gaza? I don't think so. Does that mean that people around Palestine clearly want to live under Hamas rule? In 2006, Hamas was democratically elected. I don't know if that's still the case today. There's a lot to be said, but neither of these entities have any real power in perpetuating. They don't. The only body that has access that can flip the switch in all of these equations is the Israelis. They're the ones who are keeping people in a cage. They're the ones who are wrapping the West Bank with a wall. Everything else to me is just secondary, regardless of what I think personally of any of those people. I know personally, for me, the world I envision, not just Palestine, the world I envision is a world that goes beyond states, that goes beyond this framing of power, this hierarchy in which some people will over other people. This whole idea of nation states, be it Israel or any other nation state, it's futile. It's not good. It's exclusive. I think that we can achieve a better world than that.
Well, how do you do a better world? Actually, if we just linger on that, like but politically speaking, geopolitically, you have to have representation of people. You have to have laws, and you have to have leaders and governing bodies that enact those laws and all those kind of things. You probably need to have militaries to protect people.
And imagine a world without militaries.
I can imagine it, but we're not in that world.
Yeah, I'm not saying I have all the answers or a PowerPoint in my pocket, with the instructions, but I'm saying the world I'd like to live in is one that transcends borders. It's one that does not necessitate militaries, but doesn't necessitate all of these prisons, all of these walls, all of these racist laws.
You don't think violence is a fundamental part of human nature that emerges and like combined with the hunger for power?
I do think that both of these things are like really intrinsic to the human being. I also do think there is a way to move beyond them. I'm not saying I have the answer. I think it's that way.
But you have a hope that there doesn't have to be war
Yeah,
in the world.
definitely.
Well, if you look a little bit more short term, people speak about a one-state solution, a two-state solution. What is your hope here for this part of the world? Do you see a possible future with the two-state solution, which is Palestine, Israel? Do you see a one-state solution where there is a diversity of different peoples, like in the United States, and they have equal rights in the courts and everywhere else?
I don't think there's a geography in which a two-state solution is possible. As we said earlier, Swiss cheese, there's literally settlements all over the West Bank. And I don't think it's fair. A two-state solution is fair to all of the people whose homes are still in Haifa, in Nazareth, in Jaffa, and so forth. And I don't think it's fair that I'm going to have to travel to another country to visit my cousin who's married in Nazareth, for example. And beyond that, it's just not possible. I do believe that whatever you want to call it, one state, two state, 48 states, 29 states, whatever you want to call it, refugees need to return, land needs to be given back, wealth needs to be redistributed, and a recognition of the Nakba needs to happen. That is the only way we could move forward. And regarding whether this is like a possible situation for two people to live side by side, let's ask two questions. Let's say you lived in a house with a person, your roommate, you just had a roommate who constantly beat the shit out of you. I wonder if you'd want to continue to live with them. That's one. And let's try another scenario. Let's say you live in a house with a roommate who you just absolutely hate, just absolutely oppose their existence as a people. You don't even give him, a key to your apartment. Let's say now you're like equal partners in the apartment. Would you want to live with him? I don't know. We'll see. Time will tell. But I don't think they want to live with us. Israelis are quite good. Especially Israeli diplomats are quite good at using flowery language about peace and coexistence and so on and so forth. And they're good with making us seem insane or radical or like full of hate and so on and so forth. But the policies speak for themselves. The actions on the ground speak for themselves. And I truly, I mean, every time there's an uptick, many of them leave, and I wonder. I would like to see. I wonder what would happen in a one-state solution.
Well, okay, so you've spoken eloquently about the injustice of the evictions, the demolitions, the settlements. But is there? Can you comment about the difficulty of the security from an Israel perspective when there is a large number of people that want to destroy it? How does Israel exist peacefully? This one-state solution.
I don't know, by not shooting, a journalist doing her job in the Jenin refugee camp,
But that
by
doesn't.
not killing a 14-year-old standing in his front yard. This whole talk about, security and security fence and the whole propaganda of the Israeli Defense Forces and this whole iron wall ideology in which somehow they're always defending themselves, even though they're, Netanyahu and the Israeli government continue to talk about an existential threat, about Iran being an existential threat, even though the Israeli government is the only body that holds nuclear weapons.
This is worse than
in the region.
Guadalcanal.
They're the most sophisticated army in the region, and yet they continue hiding behind their fingers and talking about an existential threat and talking about how they're insecure and so on and so forth.
No way. That
was I came here on the bus. No. I live in a house where everybody in the world can easily Google it and get its address, and anybody can just walk into my house. And this is just, and I'm lucky and privileged as a Palestinian journalist. There are many Palestinian journalists who lose their lives. This is that's real insecurity, but we don't even have time to whine about it because there's real shit going on the ground that we're preoccupied with and reporting on all the time, that we don't even have the time to talk about how limited is our institutional backing, how limited is our, cyber security, how limited is our, even healthcare, all of these things we don't even have time to complain about. But they're the real life things that formulate an insecure population. That Israel certainly does not suffer from.
Funny?
There's a tension here. It's true that the ideas of existential threats to a nation have been used to expand the military-industrial complex.
Not like Italian people,
to limit the rights of its people. So in the United States, after 9/11,
there's Guyana,
Iraq and Afghanistan were invaded under some justification of there being terror in the world. These big ideas. And in the same way, yes, Israel, with the existential threat of Iran, is used to expand its military might over the region and control over the region. But it also has some truth to it in terms of the threat that Israel is facing, including from Iran. If Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, do you think there's a threat from that?
But who has the nukes?
But
right now.
Grew up.
Yeah, but we're talking about this faraway monster that's we're scared of. It's like fear mongering. What do you mean? Who has the nukes?
Some of it is fear mongering, but some of it is true.
I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true. I think Israelis are obsessed with genocide because they have enacted genocide against us. Even when we talk about a future, a liberation of Palestine, when we're talking about anything, they constantly jump to saying things like, "Oh, they want to throw us into the sea. They want to kill all Jews." What kind of hyperbolic bullshit is that? To say that if I am chanting and marching for my home not to be taken away from me by some kind of settler court, I am somehow demanding the murder of all Jews across the world. That is hyperbolic, and the fact that we coddle it is insane to me. So no, I don't think, as things stand right now, as the power balance stands right now, I don't think there's an existential threat to Israel. And also, let's redefine what existential threat. Do we think Israel,
Women's Day,
the Israeli regime, the Zionist regime, should continue to exist in its forms, subjugating people, enacting the crime of apartheid according to a bajillion
human rights organizations? Do we think that it should continue keeping people in a
Woman's
cage?
World. Oh, yeah,
If that's
Woman's
what
World.
people
Is
are
there-
fighting to
maybe there are
save,
2 of them.
then that says a lot about the people who are feeling this
I've never-
existential threat, not me.
There's only one fucking magazine that matters.
Do your
so much
beliefs
as
represent
living.
the Palestinian people? Meaning,
I
how
don't
many
know if
people
it's-
are there that want
Should be.
Israel to be
That
gone?
woman had a fucking.
But what does it mean for Israel to be gone?
What it means is,
Man, I have to kind of
for people who think of Israel as an occupier who stole land, that needs
it's
to
not
go
a
away.
race
That
to
this should
dump.
be all
It's kind of
Palestine.
like cutting
Yeah, but
cigars.
is that a bad thing for these borders to be like for the occupation to
Anyway,
end, for
nobody's
these
watching this, so
for the
no
land to be
reaction
given
to
back? Is that a bad thing?
Well,
That
there's
would
different
crash.
definitions of
I
occupation.
am at the
Hey,
point where I'm
there's
doing quality
people in their
assurance
homes now.
for
right?
But is it their home? I'm not talking about like some random
I have to take a
some
shit,
random
like
home. But there
Well, I don't
are
know if it's a major league
many,
shit,
many,
but
many,
it's
many,
definitely
many, many,
double
many,
A.
many, 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 many Israelis
On the
who
Bristol
drink their
stool
coffee
scale,
every morning
well, it doesn't
from
really
living
get
rooms
into
that are
the
not theirs.
size. It just goes into consistency.
That are
I
not
feel
theirs,
like-
that were
I don't
taken
know. Maybe we should use
just
the
a few decades
baseball
ago.
Yeah,
to be like, oh, I
where
got a
like the
major league
owners, the rightful
seven
owners
going
of these homes
on
are still
here.
lingering
Is that
in refugee
is that
camps,
like
are still
watery,
dreaming of
or
return.
is that like
There are homes
chunky?
on the land of Israel that you wouldn't classify
I
as
got a
stolen.
major league 7 going on.
I mean, there's
okay, dude, we
like
need to
if
change
it
the
wasn't
Bristol
stolen,
stool
if it
scale
was
to
built,
just be
but is the
0 to
land
10.
stolen?
Everything's got to
Right?
be
Is
0 to 10.
the
And if
all of
everything
this
goes
again?
0 to 10, then
I
will
try
start
not to
saying
like
7
fall
to 10,
into this because it's just like it feels
I
so
guess
abstract
0 is like
and far away, and
2
and
syllables.
this is not
7
how
to 10.
liberation is going to look
All
like
right,
whatsoever. And I'm not
so
like
what's
I'm
a
not
Z?
fixated on
Is that
ethnic
really
cleansing.
watery?
That is
I
not. I'm
think
not
so. And
obsessed
then
with ethnic
10 is
cleansing.
just like a
I'm
block.
obsessed with ending the ethnic cleansing
And then you
campaign
got
that has
A,
been
you
visited
got double
upon me and my family and my
you got
community for
triple A, and then you
7+
got the major leagues.
decades. That's what I'm obsessed with.
I drink a
All of
major
this
league
other
10.
stuff about what happens to the
What is that?
settlers and like
It's almost like giving birth, girls.
you know
All
we
right.
want to kill all Jews and
A
all
lot
of
of
this. I think
times
it's
when
bullshit and I think it's ridiculous and I think
Perhaps
you
BMing
know
allegedly.
fixating on it
about
is like
man and
distracting
plugs,
from
not
the
a
focal
track.
point. There needs to be an end to all
How
of the
do they
injustices, to
describe
all of the atrocities.
childbirth to you, Rabbi?
You know,
like
a little boy from
pushing
Jerusalem
a
should be able to
softball
go
through the
jog
tip
around
of
the
your
city
penis,
without fearing
which
getting
is
shot.
just like the
That's like the
worst.
simplest thing we're
Anyway,
asking for here, and we want our land back. And those things
of all
do
the
not mean
things that I've
actually at
ever
all
seen,
the ethnic cleansing of another
I mean,
people.
I've seen some really bad stuff.
Well, but that
The worst. I've
we
seen
should be
beheadings
precise here.
allegedly,
So
and
a little boy
I've
being
never
able
seen
to
a
run
really-
around
but that'd
Jerusalem,
be tight if
that's
somebody's
a great vision. Not
like,
just
you know, they got the
safely,
one guy in front,
but without
they're like, we're, you know, that's to
racism.
America.
Yeah.
without
Boom.
hate.
And then they're like, we got
That's
one
a
guy just
beautiful
like, no,
vision,
sew that
yes.
motherfucker back
But
on.
people in West Jerusalem,
Hilarious.
people in Tel Aviv
Alright,
that have
This
homes,
is the worst.
should they stay
But
there?
I do know the bridge
Do they have the
over
right to
why
stay there?
it's Thai.
That's like maybe number 99 on
I
my
didn't even know
priorities
that was a
list. I'm concerned with the refugees. I'm concerned with the teenagers in
Why in the fuck isn't that shit
prisons.
working?
I am concerned with my
Why is it
house.
being
I'm
such a
concerned with my
bitch?
family's house in
Dog.
Haifa. I'm concerned.
This is
there's
the
a
worst.
lot for me
I
to
blame
do
Sundar Pichai for this
before
one.
I can even tend to the needs of my occupier.
Yo.
That is the least.
Do you want to welcome me for the obvious injustices?
This is the worst.
But still, the long-term vision
What if we go like this?
of existential survival of
Like be
of
super
Israel,
athletic with it.
which is the concern of its government, is the concern of its people. Do you see a future where Israelis
Let's see.
have a home in the region?
Sure, just not in my front.
There you go.
Where's the food? All right, where's the back area?
There are literally Jewish settlers, one of which from Long Island, in my literal front yard. And this is the case in hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinian homes. You know, no one is saying Jewish people shouldn't exist or they shouldn't have a state of their own. I mean, I think all religious based states are like a bad idea. All nation states are a bad idea. But whatever. That's what they want to do. That's what they want to do. But that doesn't mean that they are allowed or have the right to create and implement a system of Jewish supremacy at my expense. That's not a crazy thing to say. That is not a controversial thing to say. You can have your state, just don't kill anyone. Thank you. Have a good day. You know, like that's not a crazy thought to have.
And seek and establish a single power in the court, which is the current source of injustice.
I mean,
What do they
that's when
have
it
that
comes to like
somebody
forced
said
expulsions in our home. There's a myriad of other ways.
0%?
Through the military,
The military, I mean, the police. If you look at like how many times, I should have brought the data with me, but if you look at how little times the Israeli military or police has like investigated its own people or indicted its own people. I mean, just recently, the killer, um, who has been hailed a hero by some of Israeli society, who killed Iyad al-Hallaq, a Palestinian man who is autistic, who lives inside the occupied old city, where again, Israeli military has no business being there or jurisdiction whatsoever. He was shot and killed by an Israeli soldier who was super happy he was against. Again, they have this like siege mentality where like any moving object is going to kill them. And he was shot and killed. And despite it being in broad daylight, despite it being well documented, despite the victim being disabled, despite all of this, he was acquitted by the Israeli court. The military, the court, the government, they all work together, which is why it's so ironic to me that there are hundreds of thousands of people marching on the streets of Tel Aviv trying to save the progressive beacon that is the Israeli Supreme Court, when you find its fingerprints all over the injustices perpetuated against Palestinians, be it, legalizing and upholding the withholding of slain Palestinian bodies who were killed by the Israeli military to be used as bargaining chips by the Israeli militaries, be it making decisions to dispossess entire villages like Hiran, be it never once, granting release to any Palestinian who was held in administrative detention without charge or trial, be it upholding the legality of the family reunification law that does not allow Palestinian couples who hold different legal statuses of reuniting and living together as family. I mean, those are just some of the few things I can think of about the Israeli Supreme Court. So there, like, the real tension that exists is
Manila, which is
the lack of diversity in the Israeli political sector that makes the vision for a future so limited, because those on what seems to be like the far left are defending an extremely conservative institution that is the Supreme Court that they regard as progressive, when in fact it is the opposite of such. So what do we do? How can we talk? How can we have peace with people who are chanting to save, the very body that is displacing us? It's ridiculous.
what's your vision? Let's just take it as a microcosm of Jerusalem. What's your vision for Jerusalem looks like with a peaceful coexistence of people?
We finally found it.
As it looked like before the Israeli state emerged. I mean, we should be reading our history here. When you read like European and white historians, they'll tell you like Palestine was barren. Many of them would say like it was even without a people. There were nobody was there, or like some of them will say we were uncivilized. But the fact of the matter is, Palestine, Jerusalem particularly, had a diversity of religion. Druze, Jewish people. My grandmother continues to talk about. Well, she continued until she died. She continued to talk about her Jewish neighbors when she grew up in the old city, or like when she was born in the old city, and then her Jewish neighbors in Haifa. We even had one Jewish member of our family, Sami, actually, who just also recently passed away. Jews were a part of Palestine, and they spoke Hebrew, a different kind of Hebrew, but they spoke Hebrew, and they were. People really need to read the 100 Years' War on Palestine. It's really an excellent synopsis of the history.
Worst.
But this whole idea, this is like some kind of
stopping?
war between two religions.
Rabbi,
It's
what
so
are you doing? Not
mistaken,
Rabbi
because
Jackson, the
what's
blue-eyed
happening
Jew.
is
What are you doing?
a bunch of, frankly,
You're the
European
worst.
settlers